Good morning. This hearing will come to order. Today's hearing is Biobanking, how the lack of a coherent policy allowed the Veterans Administration to destroy an irreplaceable collection of Legionella samples. The subcommittee staff for the Investigation and Oversight Subcommittee conducted an extensive investigation into the handling of an irreplaceable collection of Legionella samples at the Veterans Affairs Pittsburgh Healthcare Clinic. The purpose of this hearing is to make public the findings of the subcommittee's investigation of this case and to highlight the need for a uniform national policy on biospecimen management. On December 4, 2006, late in the afternoon, 2 employees of the Clinical Microbiology Laboratory at the Veterans Affairs Pittsburgh Healthcare Clinic, the VA-PHS, were ordered by Dr. Mona Mellum, the Associate Chief of Staff for Clinical Services, to go to the Special Pathogens Laboratory and destroy the research collection of Dr. Victor Yu and Dr. Janet Stout. Dr. Mellum said her orders came from Michael Moreland, then the systems director. The 2 employees commandeered the help of 3 other employees, and within 3 hours, a collection that had taken 3 decades to build was gone. Dr. Yu and Stout are international experts in the detection, treatment, and control of Legionella, a bacterium that causes a kind of severe pneumonia called Legionnaire's disease, and their laboratory was internationally acclaimed. Dr. Yu was known for his work on other infectious pneumonias and antimicrobial resistance. According to Dr. David Snydman of Tufts Medical Center, one of our witnesses today, this collection was used to develop new diagnostic tests and therapies and to conduct resistance and to study resistance and mechanisms of disease transmission. The destruction of the research collection was a culmination of an acrimonious series of events that included the closing of the nationally acclaimed laboratory, the firing of Dr. Yu, the attempted firing of Dr. Stout. As an impartial audience, there is no real partisanship to any of this. And the most troubling part of the story is that the destruction of this one-of-a-kind collection occurred less than an hour after Dr. Mellum learned that formal steps were being taken the following day to transfer the collection to the University of Pittsburgh, where Drs. Yu and Stout were then affiliated, so their research could go on. And the destruction of this collection occurred after Dr. Mellum made a false statement to the system's chief of staff and the head of the research office, telling him that the collection could not be transferred because it had already been destroyed on the orders of the medical center's director. That false statement kept the head of the research office from effectively intervening to try to save the collection. Months of investigation by the subcommittee have not revealed any credible reason for the destruction of the collection. Dr. Mellum said that a former research official had approved the destruction months before. That official denies giving such approval. She also claims that the decision was made in July without ever informing Dr. Stout or Dr. Yu, both of whom were then still on staff. Dr. Moreland can't remember giving her such orders on December 4 and seems unclear about his understanding of the difference between the research specimens that we're concerned with today and clinical specimens that were being processed by the laboratory on the day that it closed. Both Dr. Mellum and Mr. Moreland are now taking the position that the collection wasn't really a research collection. It did not have to be preserved. This is despite the fact that dozens of peer-reviewed papers have come out of the laboratory in its 25 years of existence and statements made to Dr. Yu that he would be able to continue his research even if the lab closed. Dr. Moreland's testimony, or Mr. Moreland's testimony, came in late yesterday. The subcommittee has made 2 very comprehensive document requests concerning the closure of the Special Pathogen Laboratory and the destruction of its research collection. And we've received many documents, voluminous documents. But in his testimony, Mr. Moreland refers to a technical review regarding biohazards at the lab, disposal acts done in July of 2006, and a December 2006 determination that not a single one of the samples in question were collected or was collected as part of any previously approved research effort. The committee has never received any documentation of any of those assertions. Either way, either they do not exist, the documents do not exist, or they have not been provided. But in any case, the testimony is very troubling. Mr. Moreland and other witnesses from the Pittsburgh VA should remember that their testimony today is under oath, and it is simply not credible that important technical decisions were made entirely based upon conversations with no documentation. I cannot imagine the circumstances under which a federal health agency official would unilaterally order the destruction of a human tissue collection without receiving the approval of the agency's research office and the Research Compliance Committee. I cannot imagine why that official would apparently make false statements during the destruction to keep the Associate Director for Research at the center in the dark until the destruction was complete. It stuns me that in the time since those actions, neither Pittsburgh nor National VA officials have taken formal action to discipline the managers involved in this case or establish clear policy on the destruction of biomedical collections to make sure that this will never happen again. All of us may pay a price for this conduct, veterans most of all, because the nation lost one of its leading research labs on hospital infectious diseases. And while the researchers can relocate and start their work again, the research samples can never be wholly reconstituted. Those who are in hospitals, the elderly, severely sick children, or anyone else with compromised immune systems are those most at risk. The work of Dr. Yu and Dr. Stout cannot be recovered entirely. However, we can protect the work of thousands of other professionals at the VA and other federal agencies or institutions that result in the collection of biological samples, biological collections funded by taxpayer money. Those collections should not be subject to similar mishandling simply at the caprice of a powerful administrator. It is time for the Office of Science and Technology Policy to start an interagency effort to create a core set of policies for the handling, maintenance, and disposition of such collections, such specimens. And I do intend to introduce that legislation shortly. I now yield to my distinguished colleague, Representative Rohrbacher, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'm sorry that I have a bit of a cold today. Maybe I could seek your advice from the panel on what to do. If you have one of those things to cover my face, that might be an appropriate situation. So often here in Washington, D.C., when we take a look at a serious problem, we find that politics and bureaucracy has really screwed things up. And this may or may not be the case here. In this case, we might be looking at a situation where individuals were wrong, people who held power made wrong decisions, and people who make wrong decisions should be held accountable, or it will not encourage other people who hold positions of authority to take their job as seriously as their jobs dictate. If it's not an individual flaw or a situation where we have a situation where an individual has made wrong decisions, we may find in this case that the system itself is flawed. I want to congratulate the chairman on the work he's done on this issue to see if we can come down to find out exactly what is at the heart of this issue and what caused this to happen and what can be done to correct the situation. We need to hear the details to see if it is a flaw in the system, if it can be corrected, and if it is a personal situation where personal bad decisions were made for whatever reason, that those people are held accountable. Our policy on biobank issues certainly deserves our attention in relationship to looking over this particular issue. I would suggest that we should be very careful, however, to make sure that when we are proposing changes or what should be the reaction of the government to this incident, that we be careful not to introduce politics and bureaucracy in a negative way into a system that may well be making mistakes because people within the system just made flawed decisions. Maybe people were kept in positions of authority for too long. Maybe perhaps a situation where the people themselves did not have the proper oversight. So we really have to take a look where an individual, he or she did something wrong, but we can't use that as an excuse to alter the system in a way that might make it less effective in the future if we haven't targeted the reforms in the right way. So I'm very open-minded to this, and if we can make it better, we will. And you can, as the chairman stated, there's no politics in a situation like this. We work together to try to see what we can come up with that will correct a flawed situation or hold people accountable for the decisions they've made. So with that, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Look forward to the hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrbacher. Any additional opening statements submitted by members will be included in the record. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first panel of witnesses. First is Dr. Victor Yu. Dr. Yu is a professor of medicine at the University of Pittsburgh. Dr. Janet Stout is the director of the Special Pathogens Laboratory. Dr. David Snydman is the chief of the Division of Geographic Medicine and Infectious Diseases and attending physician in infectious diseases at the Department of Medicine at the Tufts Medical Center. I suspect that is not what he says at cocktail parties. His job is. You will all have 5 minutes for your oral testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record. When you complete your testimony, we will begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. It is the practice of the committee, because we are an Investigations and Oversight Subcommittee, to take testimony under oath. Do any of you have any objection to being sworn in, to swearing an oath? All the witnesses nodded their heads that they did not. The committee also provides that you may be represented by counsel. Are any of you represented by counsel at today's hearings? All three of the witnesses also nodded their heads no. If you would now please stand and raise your right hand. Please, do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? All right, all three of the witnesses said that they did so swear. Actually, if we could begin with Dr. Stout today. Dr. Stout, could you begin?
Thank you. Members of the committee, first I want to thank you for holding the committee. I am Dr. Janet Stout. I received both my master's and PhD degrees from the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public Health. I am internationally recognized as an authority on Legionnaire's disease. I have authored book chapters and more than 80 publications in peer-reviewed journals. I spent 25 years at the Pittsburgh VA Medical Center as a microbiologist in the Special Pathogens Laboratory. My scientific achievements include identifying the drinking water, not air conditioning, as the real source for hospital-acquired Legionnaire's disease. The VA Special Pathogens Laboratory was part of the VA Microbiology Laboratory and served as a National Legionella Reference Laboratory until its closure in 2006. The accomplishments of this laboratory are many. The collection of isolates and specimens housed in this collection played a major role in these accomplishments. From 1979 to 2006, we banked over 8,000 specimens from our studies on Legionnaire's disease and other infections. These specimens included isolates of Legionella and thousands of serum, respiratory, and urine samples. The role of this collection of microorganisms in our discoveries can be summarized as follows. We showed that Legionnaire's disease was acquired from hospital drinking water systems. Legionella isolates in our collection prove this association for hospitals across the United States. Our laboratory developed new and better ways to detect and treat this disease. Every antibiotic and Legionella diagnostic test in use today was tested in our laboratory. Our collection allowed new tests to fulfill FDA requirements for approval. These specimens were destroyed. We developed advanced environmental and clinical methods which were not used by many laboratories. Less experienced labs gave incorrect results and bad advice, placing patients at risk. For example, in 2005, one laboratory failed to diagnose a large outbreak of Legionnaire's disease in a nursing home. Using our collection, we showed that the urine antigen test used by that laboratory gave false negative results. The specimens that allowed us to make this discovery were destroyed. I therefore caution the Pittsburgh VA, who is performing Legionella testing for free for other VA laboratories, that this testing is being done by untrained and inexperienced technicians. Our collection included isolates from every hospital using our laboratory. Having these isolates available in the future would establish whether or not the hospital was the actual source of infection or the patient acquired the disease elsewhere. These isolates were destroyed. We demonstrated the development of resistance by Legionella to a commonly used water disinfection method. This observation was only made possible by comparison of historical isolates to present-day isolates. The specimens that allowed us to make this discovery were destroyed. We showed that the risk of illness to patients could be predicted. Other scientists have requested our specimens for study in their laboratories to study disease-causing traits and evaluate new antibiotics. These specimens are no longer available to the scientific community for study. They were destroyed. Our research was supported by the VA Merit Review System, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and industry. The VA Merit Review Study was an IRB-approved study involving 20 VA institutions across the United States. The results of this study were published in 2007 in the journal Infection Control and Hospital Epidemiology. We also showed that patients get Legionnaire's disease from drinking water in their own homes. This was an EPA-funded, IRB-approved study. All of the isolates and specimens collected during the merit review and EPA studies were destroyed. We collected these isolates for research purposes, and the research was approved. Dr. Yu will provide the committee with documentation to support this point. What did we do to save the collection? I wasn't concerned about the transfer of the collection from the VA because I knew other VA investigators had transferred their collections when they left the VA. The research office even told us that they had recently gone through this process with one of their VA physicians. In August 2006, we first expressed our concern for the safety of the collection. In an email from Dr. Yu to Dr. Graham, Dr. Yu stated, "I fear the vindictiveness of the administration may imperil this irreplaceable collection." We were reassured by Dr. Graham when he responded, "Of course I don't want to see valuable specimens destroyed." In response, Dr. Yu and I obtained the assistance of Dr. Tim Mietzner at the University of Pittsburgh, and we requested the transfer of these materials to his laboratory at the University of Pittsburgh. From August through December 2006, I actively engaged the research office in my attempt to transfer the collection to the university. VA administration was copied on these emails. I was never asked by anyone to provide any information on the contents of the collection, and there was never any indication that the disposition of the collection was in question or that the collection was in danger of being destroyed. On December 4, 2006, Dr. Snell notified the VA administration that I was to meet with the research compliance officer in the laboratory the next day to begin the transfer. Later on that same day, Dr. Snell informed me via an email that he was asked by the front office to put this process on hold. He said, "I or someone from the front office will be contacting me about this request." No one from the VA ever contacted me, and I did not know that the collection had been destroyed. Only after an inquiry from Senator Specter and Rick Earl, a reporter, did the VA publicly admit to destroying the collection. For me as a scientist and for veterans in the American public, the loss is incalculable. In protest, a petition was published in the April issue of Clinical Infectious Diseases and signed by over 250 scientists worldwide. They requested that an investigative committee review the actions of the Pittsburgh VA healthcare system regarding the closure of the laboratory and the destruction of the scientifically valuable collection of microorganisms. The petition signatories and I thank you for your time today and your effort in fulfilling this request. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Stout. Dr. Yu.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Rohrabacher and Congressman Brown, for allowing us to tell you this terrible tragedy. As you mentioned, I'm professor of medicine at the University of Pittsburgh. I've been there since 1978, and during most of those years, I was also chief of the infectious disease section at the Pittsburgh VA Medical Center. My CV is 51 pages long, but I've published 600 papers in abstract and written 6 textbooks of medicine. I've gotten many honors in my CV, but I think I'll only mention one. I received the Distinguished Research Award from the American Legion for our achievements and Janet's achievements in unraveling the mystery of how the disease was contracted and how the disease might be prevented and cured. That plaque honoring that achievement was in the lobby of the Pittsburgh VA Medical Center for many years, although I'm told that it's no longer there. The Special Pathogens Lab was established in 1980, and you gave sort of a good overview, and Dr. Stout listed its achievements. But it also made important discoveries in MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, pneumonia, urinary tract infections. We ultimately established collections of fungi and virtually all human pathogens of man that are commonplace. We established international collaborative studies with investigators in Africa, Australia, New Zealand, China, Hong Kong, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Norway, Sweden, every inhabitable continent. Investigators interested in antibiotic-resistant bacteria contributed pathogens to our laboratory, and in a huge international collaborative attempts actually collected data from these patients and then sent the isolates to one standard reference laboratory. Over 200 publications from these talented and prestigious investigative groups from France to Taiwan to Australia participated in this massive effort, which was a true international community effort. When we first started in the early 1980s, we had one microbiologist and one graduate student named Janet E. Stout, and then over time the VA asked us to become, under a mandate called the Special Clinical Resource Center, we became the Special Pathogens Lab of the entire Pittsburgh VA Center. And over the next 10 to 12 years, we've evolved into 5 laboratory scientists headed by Dr. Stout. And then in 2006, inexplicably, Mr. Moreland, the director of the VA, terminated the laboratory. On Wednesday, he came in, handed us a directive. The laboratory is closed. There was no forewarning of any sort. All 5 individuals, university employees who were scientists, were all terminated immediately. They lost their livelihood. No explanation was given. On July 12th, 1 week later, I asked for a written explanation of why this happened. The effect was so stunning that we couldn't understand why it was done, and I said, it's morally imperative for you to place in writing why you terminated this laboratory of 20-plus years with all of its accomplishments. Then give us the reasons why so that we could respond. But we couldn't even appeal because 48 hours later, all the personnel had to evacuate. They were told that if they left their personal belongings behind, they would never be able to retrieve them. And so 2 to 48 hours later, the laboratory was padlocked. However, Mr. Moreland forgot one thing. We were processing specimens for patients in the ICU, in addition to patients from medical centers all over the country. So if he terminated immediately, what about the patients at the VA Highland Drive, a few miles away? What about patients in the ICU, a few floors away? So they reluctantly gave us 14 days, but they gave me an order. No more specimens from any place else can be processed. And tell everybody that you cannot have any more specimens processed. But we had 600 clients, and they don't send us specimens every day. As outbreaks occur across the United States, public health departments who wonder if it's Legionnaire's disease send their specimens by Federal Express, and you can see the UPS and Federal Express trucks coming every day dropping off specimens. And now we had 10 to 14 days to process all these specimens. We couldn't contact 600 clients by fax. So now I had to make a decision. Should I not process these specimens? And since they gave us no reason for the closure, I sent an email to Mr. Moreland, and I said, I have a difficult decision to make. Mr. Moreland, you've told me I cannot process any of these specimens. And specimens from Bayside Hospital, Johns Hopkins affiliated hospitals, Phoenix VA were all coming in. And they were thinking that maybe they had outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease. So I, as a physician researcher, placed an email and said, I have a conscience as a physician researcher. I can decide to disobey the order and know that I will be terminated as my laboratory colleagues were terminated, or I can do my duty. I did my duty. We processed those specimens, but we needed supplies, and the supplies were kept by the security police from entering into the laboratory. Microscopes were taken from our laboratory, and there's documentation of all the disruptions. They held a hearing, and the laboratory technicians had to leave their job and go to a witch hunt type hearing, and they were told that if you don't come, maybe there's going to be problems. So they went to these hearings, and then we had to process all these specimens that were coming in, including patients in our own intensive care unit. So there was tremendous pressure on all of us. Janet Stout even ended up having to go to a cardiac clinic because she was developing chest pains. But we worked hard on it. They rose to the occasion. When we ran out of supplies, the laboratory researchers pooled their own funds to buy supplies and bring them into the lab. If they had to go to the bathroom and they walked outside the door, the laboratory door fell shut. The security guard refused to let them in. They had to use their cell phones to call the lab people inside to let them in. The work continued. And we had 15 specimens left from a government building, 14 hospitals, and from a wife of a patient who died of Legionnaire's disease who was trying to find out if the source of her husband's Legionella came from their water supply. And in the appendix is the discussion of what she went through. She was in California and couldn't find a laboratory to do the processing. And then through contact at one of the hospitals, she ended up calling Janet Stout, who advised her what to do. She estimated that the cost from the other laboratories that she contacted would be over $2,000. Janet Stout said that she'd do it for free. Send us the specimens as soon as possible. But the timing was so bad. By the time she got to the specimens and Federal expressed them to us, we planted the cultures. She wanted to know what the results were. So did we. Mr. Moreland said, you cannot look at the culture results. We had processed all the specimens. All Janet had to do was look at the culture plate, and using dyes that were formulated by this Pittsburgh VA, we could tell if there was Legionella. And then using a microscope, we could identify if it was Legionella. 15 specimens lined up on the counter. We asked for permission to go back into the hospital on day 11 after day 10 to give the results to these hospitals and to this wife. it was refused. And over the next 2 weeks, the specimens dried up. We don't know what the results were. And we thought we lost it for the hospitals. But the Phoenix VA got lucky. Why? Because their specimens were the last specimens processed. They were interpreted and read and faxed. 65% of the Phoenix VA water samples were positive for Legionella. They sent the specimens to us because they suspected an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease, but there was controversy within the own center that were these really Legionella? Well, maybe we have a VA reference lab. If it is, we'll look in the water. They found it. That was the last duty of the Pittsburgh VA Special Pathogens Laboratory.
Dr. Yu, this is compelling testimony, but could you summarize?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so the one question is, and I had to listen to it for all these years, the last 2 years. This is not approved research. It's not approved research, all these papers. And then 2 weeks ago, I got from your committee a document that I'd never seen before. And it says, VA Pittsburgh Healthcare System Publication Audit. This was the document that Mr. Moreland used to say that we did unapproved research. All these merit review publications, that wasn't unapproved. So I looked at it, and this is one of the cleverest documents that man has ever contrived. The full description is in the appendix, but I'll give you the highlights. 6 articles that had no documentation. In this document is the documentation in Appendix B. 10 out of these 39 studies, all 39 studies, there is no documentation. 10 were observational studies, and under federal code do not have to be mandated by human rights review. So they included these 10 studies that we had published. 7 studies that were published and not approved by the VA were studies from other hospitals. One of them was in Russia. And if a study is done in Russia, it doesn't need Pittsburgh VA IRB approval. 3 studies had no patients in them. And if you do a study with no patients, you don't have to have human IRB approval. Every one of the 39 articles was legitimate. So why are these microbes so important? Well, here is one example. One study came from, published in Chest. It said there was no documentation, and in the appendix, the documentation is there. 2 other studies by Janet Stout said no documentation, and they were there. And what were those studies? We received a compound from Daiichi, Japan. We were looking for antibiotics that would cure Legionnaire's disease because the mortality was still high using existing antibiotics. Dr. Stout devised an intracellular model that you wouldn't have to use animals. So using that model, she found that this compound was highly active, more active than any compound we'd ever seen. Then we recommended that it go into clinical trials. Ethel McNeil developed the compound for clinical trials, and it was given to several thousand patients in the United States with community pneumonia. And hospitals all over the United States started sending their culture specimens to Janet Stout so that to see if they had Legionnaire's disease. And we found all these cases of Legionnaire's disease that no one would have suspected if they had not been sent to Dr. Stout. And then we broke the code. What antibiotic did these patients receive? They received levofloxacin, the new name that Ortho McNeil gave this compound. The mortality for Legionnaire's disease in this study was 0%. Well, no antibiotic is 100% effective. 4 years later, in the largest outbreak ever to hit Europe, over 200 patients contracted Legionnaire's disease. The decision was made to give every single patient levofloxacin. Not a single patient died. And think about all the patients who died in the American Legion outbreak in 1976. The organisms that we had, Mr. Moreland destroyed all of these organisms. We now receive compounds from all over the world, and we can't do the studies anymore and we can't devise a diagnostic test because of what Mr. Moreland did. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yu. Dr. Snydman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Dr. David Snydman. I'm Chief of the Division of Geographic Medicine and Infectious Diseases at Tufts Medical Center in Boston and Professor of Medicine and Microbiology at Tufts University School of Medicine. I offer my CV, which outlines my training and expertise in the fields of microbiologic research as well as clinical research within the field of infectious disease. Due to time constraints, I will not go into details about my training or publication record, which are listed on my CV, but I'll state for the record that I conduct studies in infectious diseases using the microbiology laboratory, and I'm nationally and internationally recognized for my research. I've been funded by the NIH for many years for many of the studies that I've published. I've collaborated with Victor Yu in a variety of studies conducted over the past 20 years or more. Many of these have been published in the highest level journals within the field of clinical infectious diseases and microbiology. Let me also state that I have publicly praised the VA healthcare system in an editorial I wrote for the Mayo Clinic proceedings regarding quality of care around central line-associated infections. So I come to this proceeding as someone who recognizes the value of the VA healthcare system. I've never been an employee of the VA, but have worked as a medical resident at the Boston VA and volunteered in the Atlanta VA while I was employed by the Centers for Disease Control. I'm trying to offer as dispassionate and objective an opinion as possible. I've been asked by the staff to comment on a number of issues pursuant to these proceedings, including the value of the resource of the Special Pathogens Laboratory in the Pittsburgh VA Hospital, as well as the studies which were foreclosed by the destruction of the isolates, and the value of the research conducted by Drs. Yu and Stout. I've also been asked as to how I learned of the destruction of the isolates housed in the Special Pathogens Laboratory, to comment on my actions, and to comment on changes in policies Congress should consider in order to prohibit such actions from happening in the future. First, let me say from the outset that the question should be broadened to include isolates other than Legionella, since many of the isolates the Special Pathogens Laboratory housed were microbiologic species of bacteria and fungi other than Legionella. I first learned there was a problem in the Special Pathogens Laboratory in July of 2006. I actually called Dr. Yu in late June or early July of that year to discuss a case of a very rare disease, Legionella endocarditis. I wanted him to try to isolate the organism from a heart valve that needed to be replaced in a patient I was consulting on. Our laboratory had not been able to isolate the organism, but there was a strong suspicion that Legionella was causing the disease based on a number of clinical factors. Since treatment requires 6 months or more of therapy, I wanted to get as definitive an answer as possible. I knew that Dr. Yu had the expertise to perform specialized studies on the valve, including the use of molecular diagnostic tools. He told me that he would try to perform the studies, to hold on to the blood cultures, and he would give me instructions as to how to send them. After some time, he told me he would not be able to perform the studies and indicated the laboratory would be shut down. I was quite disturbed and asked if there was anything I could do. I subsequently wrote to the VA Hospital Administration in Pittsburgh protesting this action, as well as Senator Specter and some in the Pennsylvania congressional delegation. I later found out, much to my dismay, that the isolates from the whole collection were destroyed. I eventually wrote the Viewpoints piece for the journal Clinical Infectious Disease, which is the official clinical journal of the Infectious Disease Society of America. I have appended this article for submission with my testimony. With respect to the research done by Dr. Yu and Stout, one can only conclude that it is of the highest caliber in the world. They are internationally recognized for their work and expertise in Legionella as well as other pathogens, and their laboratories set the standard for our understanding of the environmental control for Legionella. If I may read into the record part of the Viewpoints piece, I believe the committee will get a flavor for the value of the collection. Quote, Dr. Yu established a series of national and international collaborations to elucidate our understanding of the microbiologic and clinical management issues of bacteremia due to many different organisms. These studies were seminal in many respects. They changed our understanding of the relationship between appropriate and inappropriate therapy, the relationship between the minimum inhibitory concentrations of isolates to antimicrobial agents in outcome, and the molecular epidemiology of relapse and reinfection, as well as relatedness of strains throughout the world. The studies are far too numerous to articulate in detail or even list here in total, but they include studies of the major pathogens that confound us today, including Staphylococcus aureus, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, extended spectrum beta-lactamase-producing Klebsiella pneumoniae, Enterobacter species, Stenotrophomonas multifilia, Enterococcus species, Bacteroides fragilis, Streptococcus pneumoniae, and Candida. The concept was simple. Observe the clinical presentation of bacteremia or fungemia and follow outcomes while correlating microbiology to outcome. The studies were prospective, isolates collected and sent to a central laboratory, the Pittsburgh VA Special Pathogens Lab, for more definitive analysis. Each of the studies emanating from this collection has changed our knowledge base and contributed significantly towards optimal management of patients with these infections. Capturing the isolates and making sure they were sent was an important and difficult task, especially for fastidious organisms like Strep pneumoniae and Bacteroides species. Given the international component, as well as the requirements for sending specimens across national borders, these studies were difficult to perform. All studies were approved as per local IRB requirements, and permits were obtained from regulatory authorities. Nevertheless, the number of studies and important insights total well over 100 peer-reviewed articles and have provided important information that correlate outcome with the use of certain antibiotic classes as well as levels of susceptibility. Some of the studies have challenged prevailing dogma and helped provide data for the CLSI, the Clinical Lab Standards Institute. I go on to point out, quote, these isolates were accrued purely for the advancement of science, and beneficiaries of these studies were the patients infected by these microbes. Moreover, these isolates and samples would have proven invaluable in the future in that these strains would enable comparison over time for changes in pathogen virulence, antimicrobial susceptibility correlation with outcome, and changing genetic diversity, as well as the development of new molecular tests, end of quote. The value of the collection is that it was linked to clinical outcomes. This kind of collection does not really exist anywhere in the world, and these studies are really quite difficult to organize and complete. The reason this is so important is that one can correlate microbiologic factors to clinical outcomes, and with a large number of patients and specimens to study, one can control for confounding variables, such as underlying host factors, which might relate to the clinical outcome. The committee should note that one of our studies on pneumococcal bacteremia was given a national award at the annual meeting of the Infectious Disease Society, the Emanuel Walensky Award, as the best clinical paper for the year. The studies which were foreclosed by the destruction of these isolates included any study of new pathogenic factors that might be related to microbial pathogenesis in a variety of organisms, changing microbial diversity, which we recognize is continually evolving, and factors that might relate to antimicrobial resistance and susceptibility. While these organisms exist in nature and can be grown from the environment as well as people, the fact that there was a collection of organisms linked to outcomes made the collection invaluable to science. It would have been relatively simple to maintain the collection since many organisms are maintained in freezers in a holding solution. Some agreement should have been entered into between the parties that wanted to close the lab and Drs. Yu and Stout in order to give them time to make arrangements for transport of the specimens to another laboratory. To just destroy the specimens as was done was a wanton, thoughtless act. It is for this reason that I wrote my viewpoints piece for publication and appended a petition which has been signed by a number of clinical and microbiologic research scientists throughout the world, and I'm happy to attend these proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Snydman. Snydman. What did I say? Snydman. I understand that Mr. Moreland will testify. His written testimony submitted last night asserts that none of the samples were, and this is a quote from the testimony, collected, labeled, cataloged, and properly stored to constitute a scientific collection. One of the people who cleaned out the refrigerators, the lab on December 4, said that the individual vials had numbers, both numbers and letters on them, and Dr. Stout has attached to her testimony a catalog that looks to our staff, who has more expertise than I do. It looks like a thorough catalog. Is that how samples are collected, labeled, cataloged, and stored to constitute a scientific collection?
Are you asking me?
Yes, yes.
Yes,
Dr. Snydman.
absolutely. Absolutely. They typically will have a laboratory number that will refer in a notebook or some other central repository the linkage. For a couple of reasons that's done. One is to protect the identity of the individual from whom the isolate has been obtained, and also to have kind of a linear catalog that can refer to specimens, and they're usually grouped in boxes in freezers so that they can be ascertained for subsequent analyses as needed. So that's very typical.
All right. And Dr. Stout, were the numbers and letters and what you part of your cataloging of the collection?
Yes, and for those of you who've never seen a scientific collection, I wanted to show you with this visual aid. There are 81 little compartments in these boxes, and this is what is a freezer vial. And what we would write on the side is the number and some information about the material in there. We would write the same number on the top so that when someone went into the box, they could see easily where they wanted to go to find the isolate. And then each of these boxes was put into a stainless steel rack, and that rack held 20 individual boxes. Our collection of microorganisms were stored in this very orderly manner.
Okay, and that's a standard procedure.
That's
in
a standard
cataloging.
procedure,
Okay.
and in our procedure manual, which the laboratory service had, because we were under laboratory service when we were performing clinical testing, is the standard operating procedure describing that process.
Your testimony has established well, as has our staff study, a report, that there was a great deal of peer-reviewed research that resulted from research on this collection. Is a proper catalog of samples necessary for peer-reviewed research? Dr. Stout?
Absolutely. One of the examples that I provided to the committee was a paper where we were using new molecular tests to link the organisms from hospital water systems to patients. It's called pulse field gel electrophoresis. And that group of organisms was retrievable from the freezer because we had catalog those organisms, and we could go back and use new tests to evaluate those new tests. And in fact, we've had requests from other scientists for those very organisms, and in the publication is the stock number that is on the vial in the freezer, and those individuals in other countries have asked for those organisms for further study.
Okay. Dr. Snydman, do you agree with what Dr. Stout just said? Is proper cataloging a necessary part of peer-reviewed research?
Yes, I would say absolutely.
And so if this collection were not properly cataloged, it would not have resulted in the number of peer-reviewed articles that it appears to have resulted in.
Absolutely.
Okay. Dr. Stout, when did you first hear these criticisms of your collection, that it wasn't done scientifically, it wasn't collected or labeled or cataloged or properly stored to make it a real scientific collection?
I believe I was told that by the committee staff after they had conducted interviews, and I didn't find that to be a credible statement.
You never heard it from Dr. Mellon?
No.
You never heard it from Mr. Moreland?
No, and I never had any direct conversations with them. I believe they have claimed that they asked me for information about the catalog collection, and no one from either the research department or the clinical laboratory asked me for specific information. When I was in the process of working with the research group to make the transfer, all they were concerned about was the paperwork, and they were apparently trying to help me do that.
Dr. Yu, when did you first hear of these criticisms of how your collection was cataloged, that it wasn't scientific?
I wrote many communications to them, and the letters are documented in the appendix. I never heard anything from them, and I never heard this particular excuse used to justify destruction of the organisms.
All right, Dr. Mellum never told you before, or told you to your face, or even in an email, which is
That's right.
kind of like to your face, that there was some failure in the way that the collection was collected, labeled, and cataloged and stored.
Yes, I've never had any communication with Dr. Mel.
Okay. My 5 minutes have expired. Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and again, appreciate your leadership in directing your staff to come to the early as you obviously have. I am a former journalist, and remind people of that. Journalists really, we know this much about that much, but we don't know this much about anything. I have to admit, some of the words that were being used today, I don't know what those words were, and I'm a man of words. So, excuse me.
I thought that Dr. Snydman was just showing off.
So, let me ask a couple questions here about the nature of your laboratory. There are two natures to the laboratory that we're talking about. One is a research component, and the other is a diagnostic and clinical component that basically services other hospitals. Is that right?
I was also head of the clinical microbiology laboratory, and that laboratory handles specimens from the local VA hospitals. And then I was also head of the special pathogens laboratory, and that is a research laboratory. However, since we had outbreaks of Legionnaire's disease within our own hospital initially, sometimes there was interaction between the two. But the publications and the personnel in the special pathogens laboratory were the main component of the research.
Okay. The research has been going on since 1976, or how long?
It's about, the special pathogens lab was really started approximately 1979 to 1980. And that was when...
Okay, so it's been going on since 79 or 80,
Yes.
and that's, let's see, 28 years, almost 30 years
Yes.
now. And during that time period, you have managed to actually discover the cause of Legionnaire's disease, and identify this, what do you call it, bacilla or whatever it was?
Bacteria.
Okay, bacteria that actually has resulted in these deaths and these horrible problems for people. So you discovered that. How long ago was that was discovered?
Janet made the first discovery that it could be contracted from hospital water. It was published in 1982 in the New England Journal of Medicine and in 1983 in the Lancet.
Okay. So you're, number one, let me just note, I, like everybody else, thought it was the air conditioning up until right now. So I understand that. If indeed you come to a point where you have identified what the cause is, and you've had about over 20 years of research into that, was there a need for further research as compared to utilizing the resources for diagnostic and helping with specific patients that you described? Was there a need for further research in this?
As a specific example, microbes are evolving, and antibiotic resistance is now a major problem. And it turns out, actually, just 2 days ago, received commentary from one of my colleagues in France. They believe that Legionella has a capability to evolve resistant to levofloxacin, and they wanted us to test their hypothesis with the organisms that we had in our collection.
So the actual, the discovery was made years ago, but the ongoing research is vitally important because these bacteria change, and we need to keep on top of it. Is that
Exactly.
it, basically?
And if I may just add, in addition to therapy and treatment, we're also, and have been for many years, trying to put the tools in the toolbox to prevent the disease, which includes treatment of water distribution systems with various methods to control the presence of the bacteria in water. And just like with antibiotics, there's no perfect solution, so we continuously do research to perfect those techniques.
Okay, let me note, I think that would be that's a very worthy research. We're going to be talking to someone in the Veterans Administration who you've been pointing to decisions that he made later on. What if he tells us that that research is something that he supports but isn't within his budget?
Well, Doctor, I'm sure, Doctor, you have something to say, but what's interesting to me is that in the September issue of Clinical Infectious Diseases is a report demonstrating that there's an increase in the incidence or the number of cases of Legionnaire's disease that's been noted. And that document is, I believe, the last document in your report here.
Yeah, listen, first of all, let me just say that I would be supportive of this research. This research sounds like it's very important. I'm trying to make sure that we are not totally villainizing a man who we have given, and people who we've given the responsibility to run certain budgets.
Well, I think the other point to be made is that veterans are disproportionately affected by this disease.
Okay. And
one other point, we received funding from industry for the levofloxacin study, and actually the first effective disinfection measure was placed at the Pittsburgh VA. Los Angeles VA tried some things, but the solution came from Pittsburgh. All of those disinfection systems were put in gratis. And the levofloxacin and azithromycin, the other major antibiotic that we discovered effective for Legionnaire's disease, VA patients got the medicines for free from the pharmaceutical industry. So we actually brought funding into the Pittsburgh VA, and that was one of the reasons that we were made a special clinical resource center, because we could actually bring in funds.
Well, it sounds like the research is really important, and I have no doubt, and I would imagine our other agrees with that the research is very important. You also serve an important function in your diagnostic help for people who are actually have contracted that. And sometimes we do give people the authority to try to make decisions based on and budget decisions sometimes lead people to do crazy things. So we'll have to take a look and hear the whole testimony. But thank you very much, and thank you for your good work. I know you saved lots of lives. I appreciate that very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holbarger. Dr. Brown?
I want to remind my colleague from California that we're all ignorant about some things. I thank y'all for y'all's work. I'm a practicing physician, and I certainly understand the importance of the clinical work that you're doing, and how levofloxacin and azithromycin have been very instrumental in treating not only Legionnaire's disease, but many others that my patients have enjoyed the fruits of y'all's efforts. I'd like to ask Dr. Yu and Dr. Stout individually, why do you think y'all's lab was closed?
We asked that question in writing, and it's the letter in the appendix. Why would you do this? I did want to say it had nothing to do with funds, because we were bringing in funds from EPA and industry and so forth, and other laboratories that needed the work. They actually paid a small fee too. I don't know the answer, but I think the people behind me can answer that question. It's inexplicable why that happened.
Dr. Stout, do you have any knowledge or even speculation on why the lab was closed?
I think probably most of the people reading the information that's been provided and collected by the staff come down to the same question that you're asking, because it's essentially inexplicable, given the value of the laboratory, not only for the clinical laboratory, but the other infectious disease physicians that were practicing not only at the Pittsburgh VA, but nationwide. We served that function, and we supported them not only in with regard to Legionella detection and diagnosis, but also in their other investigations of other pathogens. I'm reminded of a term about short-sighted businessmen, where they fail to, or they act before they actually understand the scope and the value of that which they are proposing to cut. So that I believe that there was a failure at all levels within this administration to not only protect the value of the laboratory, but the value of the collection.
Are either of you familiar with any of the processes or procedures that are required for a VA lab closure?
I have read the document that was associated with the research centers of excellence, and that there was terminology in there about orderly closure and having plans for those closures. Yes.
Dr. Yu?
Yes, I was aware of that. And actually, when I had to go through an interrogation, I pointed out the specific memorandum in my interrogation that one of the points that they made is that there was no mandate for this laboratory, something that was, again, so incredibly difficult to comprehend, since the previous director had actually mandated that. And I pointed this out to Mr. Moreland and his group.
Do either of y'all know if the policies and the procedures for VA lab closures were followed in this case with SPL?
The policy says that you have to arrange for orderly closure to ensure that patients are not affected and so forth. And that clearly wasn't done. It was a strike of lightning that I think really caught Senator Specter's eye as to that just didn't seem right, that on a lab that's there for 30 years, on Wednesday you close it on Friday.
So it's your contention that those procedures and policies that are put in place for VA lab closures were not followed in this case for SPL?
They were not followed.
And were there any, from your testimony, I assume, but I want you to restate this, there were clinical specimens that were undergoing those studies for antibiotic resistance or for identification and those types of things that were shut off without any final determination of what that isolate was, what any kind of antibiotic treatment was, or anything else. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Would this, in your opinion, open some liability for patient safety?
Turns out that there was one major affiliated hospital of one of the most prestigious universities in the United States had sent specimens to us, and that individual was so perturbed when we were unable to give him the results, when all we had to do was open the cabinet and look at it under the microscope. He wrote me a letter saying, "You've done great work, but go out on the high road. Give me those results." We sent that communication to the administration and to Senator Arlen Specter, and Specter asked them to release the results. They let those cultures die, but I understand a settlement was made with the Pittsburgh VA and the water contractor or water consultant who had sent the specimens to our laboratory, but that's what I heard. So they paid off this individual who actually, I think, was very, very concerned about the implications of not following through on a commitment.
I think my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chairman welcomes both Dr. Brown's expertise and his use of the word y'all. I now recognize myself for a second round of questions. Mr. Moreland has his written testimony, and presumably his oral testimony under oath later today, will be that he was shocked to learn that there was research going on in his laboratory. Dr. Stout, I understand that part of your work, including the research on the Legionella at that hospital, that VA hospital, resulted in your playing a significant role in developing a protocol for reducing the risk of Legionella at the VA's hospital system. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Did the VA embrace that work? Did they know that you were doing it there, or did they say, "What on earth were you doing research"?
It's difficult for me to understand how the administration of the hospital in which we worked was completely unaware of the work that we had been doing for more than 25 years. The basis for the VA directive, which was published in February of 2008, came from our work and came from direct collaboration with the VA Medical Inspector General. That piece of information was among the various pieces of information provided to the administration as justification for our continuing to serve the VA and the nation. So I'm not sure exactly when Mr. Moreland said that he was unaware, but he certainly was aware of our accomplishments, including that, before they made the decision to close the laboratory.
Okay. Just a couple of other questions about Mr. Moreland's written testimony. And these can be very quick answers, yes or no. His testimony is that following a technical review by the ACOS for clinical support, we found it presented a potential biohazard to both employees and our veterans. The SP lab lacked a defined and approved research activity. Dr. Yu or Dr. Stout, did anyone ever tell you that there was a technical review and a finding that your research or the maintenance of this collection presented a potential biohazard?
No.
When did you first hear that?
Now.
Right now, this minute. Okay. Dr. Yu, Dr. Stout, you apparently conducted months of negotiations on the transfer of this collection to another facility where you could continue research. Could you describe fairly briefly those negotiations, Dr. Yu or Dr. Stout?
I probably should do that because it was my communication with the research department at the VA from August to December. There were numerous documents, mostly emails, between myself and the research department. The first was with Dr. Graham, then Dr. Sonnell subsequently, and then Dr. Sonnell directed one of his individuals, the research compliance officer, to work with me to effect that transfer. And if I may just correct a misconception, both Dr. Graham and Dr. Sonnell each had conversations with Dr. Melham in which she led them to believe that it was her intention to destroy the collection. Therefore, they were forewarned. It was not the fact that, although they were misled in December, they all had an opportunity to protect the collection as early as September when they were informed of her intention to destroy it.
Dr. Snydman, you have worked with Dr. Yu. You're an infectious disease researcher yourself, which is why you were able to show off by rattling off all those, the names of all those bacteria. In our second panel will be about policies and protocols, what perhaps should happen. It appears that a great many laboratories do not necessarily have written protocols, but there's sort of a habit or common sense, common decency of seeing first if there's another researcher at the same institution when a researcher is leaving that would use the the samples for their research, whether the researcher who's leaving would take it with them, or whether it could be given to somebody else, that there's no one there that would continue the research or has any interest. And it's only if no researcher appears to have any interest at all that samples are destroyed. Is that consistent with your own impression of what happens?
I would say yes. In general, if there's someone who's taking over or collaborating, the specimens there would be some preservation and transport of the specimens. But if there isn't anyone else, they would be they might be destroyed.
All right. Are you aware of other instances when a research institution destroyed a specimen collection
No.
without consulting with the research staff?
No.
Are you aware of any circumstances? Well, this seems to be a redundant question, but if redundancy is a sin, all politicians are going to hell. Do you know of any circumstances in which, or can you imagine a research institution destroying a collection while there were negotiations underway for what to do with the collection?
No.
Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, we are novices here in a number of ways, both in terms of the subject of your research, also in exactly how the structure works, because we have a broad area of examination. Are there, first of all, I take it that your laboratory worked somewhat independently because, and that up until now you really haven't had any close relationship with top people in the Veterans Administration.
I would say literally that would be not true, because over the years I participated in numerous activities through the VA Central Office Infectious Disease Group, as did Dr. Yu, and we were asked to be lecturers and to participate in the development of guidebooks on infectious diseases.
But would that be people at the top, at the very top level of the VA, or just people who are operating within the VA?
Not in Pittsburgh, in Washington.
I mean,
yes.
Okay. First of all, you've accomplished a lot, and we should all be grateful for that. And when I mentioned earlier that bureaucracy gets in the way of all the stuff we do here in Washington, a lot of times you can trace things down to just the way people operate and the rules of bureaucracy within a certain parameter there. And let me ask you this. There are certain controls that laboratories in the NIH and CDC and others who do whose only areas of research and not necessarily helping with hospitals like you are also doing, but there's a lot of controls on human subject research. Now, have you been under that same sort of umbrella of regulations as to how you can operate as would happen under the labs of NIH or CDC?
Yes. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency study involved interactions with patients, so it was approved by the IRB as well as the VA Merit Review study and numerous other studies by Dr.
Okay, so
Yu.
you're not just operating out on your own and
No.
ignoring what all the other labs have to do because they're under NIH
No, and in fact,
control.
there was tremendous oversight over what we did from very different bodies.
All right, and that's really an important element here, because I think what we're being told is that somebody asked for a raise, which got somebody's attention, and all of a sudden somebody had not realized that you existed before. Frankly, if I had not realized that you existed before, and then heard that you had been involved with such important work, I would be very happy, and I would have tried to be your friend and take credit for everything you did. So the fact is, that's the way it works in Washington quite a bit, and instead, it seems that it seems here that personalities have come to play, and that what often we see in Washington, also within the bureaucracy, is at times people get a little bit miffed that their authority is being challenged in some way. Do you think that there's a personality end to this, about people worrying that they're, rather than looking at the value of what you're doing, that they were only looking at maybe their authority was being challenged?
Well, what I'm heartened by is the work that the chairman and the committee will do to prevent this from ever happening again.
Right.
I think that there were some checks and balances available within the administration in Pittsburgh to prevent this from happening, and they were completely disregarded.
And was that due to, as I say, people getting miffed, or a personality situations being brought into into what should have been a professional
I think
situation, or was this a real flaw in the system?
I think it was both. I think that there were people in the administration that cared more about themselves than science, medicine, or veterans. I think that what the committee has shown in the hard work of the staff is that the measures that we had faith in, and we were working in good faith with the research department to transfer the collection, the atmosphere in this administration prevented them from acting respectively and responsibly.
Well, certainly any lab that's shut down should be, anybody who's told, and whose research is as important as yours, should be given enough advance notice that these type of problems, that the disaster that we're talking about wouldn't have happened. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have gotten from you the particular points we wanted covered in your testimony, but I am a recovering lawyer, and it occurs to me that you all have been wronged. Obviously, others have been wronged too. We will never know who has been wronged. We will never know that someone who died from a antibiotic-resistant staph infection might not have died had your specimens not been destroyed. But you all have been wronged professionally. Have you talked to a lawyer? Okay.
I've talked to a lawyer,
Okay.
but so far I really still recovering psychologically from this blow, frankly.
Well, I certainly am not dispensing legal advice, but my sense of how the law has developed over the last several hundred years is that some conduct, some event, strikes us as unjust. In our viscera, something seems unjust to us, and then we engage our intellect to explain why it is unjust. And from that comes legal concepts, whether it's the law of property or of contract or of tort. You all have suffered an injustice, and I would encourage you to talk about whether you might have some redress from that.
Are you still practicing?
I am not. There is an election in less than 2 months. It is my hope that I will have some continuity of employment here, and that
You have our vote.
I will be unavailable to practice law. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Rohrbacher, anything else?
One last point, and that is when I first ran for office, my most successful slogan during my first campaign was, "Vote for Dana, at least he's not a lawyer."
Well, I'm glad you all have a sense of humor. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you. And I thank all of you. We will now have our next panel, and we'll have about a 2-minute break while you all step down and the next panel steps up. We're back. I would now like to introduce our second panel. Dr. Jim Vaught is the Deputy Director of the Office of Biorepositories and Biospecimen Research at the National Cancer Institute. Dr. Janet Nicholson is the Senior Advisor for Laboratory Science at the Coordinating Center for Infectious Diseases at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. You each have 5 minutes for your oral testimony, and your written testimony will be included in the record of the hearing. When you complete your testimony, we will have questions. Each member will have 5 minutes. We'll proceed in rounds of 5 minutes each. It is the practice of the subcommittee to take testimony under oath. Do either of you have an objection to being sworn in, to swearing an oath? Both have said or nodded no. The committee also provides that you may be represented by counsel, or either of you represented by counsel at today's hearing. Both have said or nodded no. Please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? Both witnesses did so swear. Dr. Vaught, please begin.
Thank you and good morning, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Rohrbacher, members of the subcommittee. I'm Dr. Jim Vaught, the Deputy Director of the Office of Biorepositories and Biospecimen Research, or OBBR, at the National Cancer Institute, part of the National Institutes of Health, an agency of the Department of Health and Human Services. I've been engaged in the area of biospecimen research and biorepository management for over 15 years, and I've participated in the development of a number of practices and policies relevant to today's discussion. This testimony will highlight 4 specific activities relevant to the hearing topic. 1, the NCI best practices for biospecimen resources. 2, a trans-NIH effort to develop a policy framework for biospecimen collections. 3, the NIH Scientific Director's Subcommittee on Biorepository Practices and Guidelines within the Intramural Research Program. And 4, the Interagency Working Group on Scientific Collections. These activities were triggered in part by the acknowledgement that the value of biospecimens and other scientific research collections is not always recognized, and that these collections need to be managed in an optimal way. Substandard practices can have a negative impact on research studies as well as the practice of medicine. In September 2007, the HHS produced a personalized healthcare document that recognized the critical importance of biospecimens to the research infrastructure that will support personalized medicine. The vision of personalized medicine is one in which the standard of medical care is improved by adding an individual's genetic and molecular profile to the decision-making process. With the support of senior NCI leadership, the OBBR worked in a highly collaborative manner with many NIH and external experts to develop the NCI best practices for biospecimen resources. For the purpose of today's discussion, the recommendations in Section C1 of the best practices concerning custodianship of specimen collections are the most relevant. We consider the custodianship issue to be so important that we sponsored a workshop on ownership and custodianship issues in biospecimen research in October 2007, which resulted in a series of more specific recommendations that we're considering for incorporation into the next version of the NCI best practices. The NIH Scientific Director Subcommittee was formed to make recommendations to the scientific directors concerning biorepository practices and policies within the NIH Intramural Research Program. As a result of the work of this subcommittee during 2006 and 2007, the NIH published guidelines for human biospecimen storage and tracking within the NIH Intramural Research Program. These guidelines make specific recommendations regarding 1, the transfer of specimen custodianship, and inform consent information when the responsible investigator leaves NIH or when the custodianship needs to be changed for other reasons. And 2, reporting requirements for the specimen inventory and tracking systems being used. In addition, NIH intramural investigators were directed in a June 2006 memorandum to include in their institutional review board packages the manner that specimens are stored, tracked, and what will happen to the specimens at the completion of the protocol. As a result, any decision to destroy or transfer specimens out of NIH is carefully monitored by scientific directors as well as IRBs. At NIH, the specimens obtained belong to the government, not the researcher. Plans to move materials outside NIH must include appropriate material transfer agreements and must be approved. NIH policy does not permit a scientist leaving the NIH to disperse his or her materials without review. The federal-wide Interagency Working Group on Scientific Collections was formed in response to a call from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and the White House Office of Management and Budget for federal agencies to address the scientific, environmental, societal, and national security needs for collections. As we had found in our assessment of the NCI and NIH collections, the IWGSC survey found that federal agencies often do not have standardized, comprehensive approaches to the long-term management and use of their scientific collections. The working group is evaluating recommendations that are consistent with NIH long-term management principles. In conclusion, since many such collections are priceless and irreplaceable, adoption of practices such as those developed by NCI and other groups that I noted will be critical if we are to preserve them in the condition necessary to make the scientific discoveries and medical advances for which they were collected. Based on these considerations, the NCI best practices reflect the following themes with respect to developing a custodianship plan at the beginning of a study or program. 1, appoint a custodian to address long-term management of specimen collections. 2, manage conflicts of interest. 3, follow all applicable regulations and policies. And 4, include plans for management after a study ends, funding is lost, or similar situations requiring custodianship changes. These are extremely important issues concerning critical resources that are central to our biomedical research infrastructure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. Nicholson.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chairman and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. I am Dr. Janet Nicholson, and it is my pleasure to be here in my capacity as Senior Advisor for Laboratory Science to the Director of the Coordinating Center for Infectious Diseases at CDC. I have nearly 20 years of experience working inside CDC's infectious disease laboratories and have provided expert guidance on infectious disease laboratory-related activities. I have also represented CDC laboratory community on complex, overarching infectious disease-related scientific issues, including specimen collection, use, and storage. I have co-authored 95 research or review papers and have delivered roughly 80 presentations in the fields of emerging infectious diseases, laboratory response to bioterrorism threats, and immune responses to HIV infection. I currently serve as the U.S. representative for the Global Health Security Action Group Laboratory Network, as a member of the Trans-Federal Task Force for Optimizing Biosafety and Biocontainment Oversight, as an ex officio member of the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, and the President-elect and on the Board of Directors for the Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute, or CLSI. I am pleased to appear before you this morning to address CDC's laboratory specimen collections. I'd like to give a brief overview on CDC's management of infectious disease specimens, and then I'd be happy to answer your questions. Each year, CDC laboratories receive hundreds of thousands of human and environmental specimens from its various partners in public health throughout the United States and abroad. Many of these specimens contain organisms or products that need to be identified. Other specimens are unique population-based collections. Virtually all of these specimens are automatically archived because of their potential importance to public health and safety. Upon receipt at CDC, specimens are logged in, tracked, and examined. In the Coordinating Center for Infectious Diseases, my coordinating center, specimens are logged, tracked, and reporting is managed by an automated system called STAR LIMS. Any given specimens or samples we receive may be entirely consumed by the testing process, or sufficient quantities may have been obtained for storage. In the case of diagnostics work, reports of laboratory results from tests done on these samples are provided to the submitter or other appropriate authorities. At times, portions of the samples may be placed in long-term storage and are retained for future use. In extremely rare circumstances, some of our archive specimens may be destroyed because of lack of relevance, loss of viability during storage, lack of appropriate documentation, space limitations, or when IRB, or the Institutional Review Board regulations, require so. Maintaining CDC's world-renowned culture collections of specimens is essential in carrying out the agency's public health functions, that is, to detect, control, and prevent morbidity and mortality from diseases. CDC manages its specimens in a manner commensurate with the scientific integrity required by HHS guidelines and policies. Each collection has a curator, as you heard before, whose responsibility is to create, maintain, and oversee the use of these special collections. These specimen collections are unique and unmatched anywhere in the world. Not only are they critical to CDC's mission, they are also critical to our commitment to the global community to serve as a reference diagnostic center. The collections support the work accomplished in our nearly 30 World Health Organization collaborating centers for reference research on viruses, bacteria, parasites, and fungi. Rare and irreplaceable collections of specimens are stored at CDC. Some of these historical collections date back to before 1945, which was before the era of antibiotics. CDC routinely performs reference and research activities on rare and unusual and novel bacterial and viral pathogens. This specialized work requires comparison of the new unknown organism to isolates of these archive strains with similar characteristics. Through this work, new pathogens, such as SARS, may be discovered when novel isolates are shown to be unrelated to any archived organism or DNA sequences on record. We would not be able to conduct our comprehensive work on pathogen discovery without these valuable strain collections. In the early 1990s, CDC and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, or ATSDR, developed a specimen repository that provides for secure, long-term storage and management of our valuable collection of specimens. The CDC ATSDR Specimen Packaging Inventory and Repository, or CASPR, is a significant resource for the management of specimen collections at CDC because it provides unique archival space and utilizes a documented management system for these archives. The CASPR Policy Board developed policies which include admission of specimen collections, ensuring data quality and security, documenting data and specimen sharing, specimen and data withdrawal and use, human subjects review issues, review of specimen usage and disposal of unwanted specimens, and contingency and disaster management. Each collection must be unique and not redundant of other collections already stored. CDC's diagnostic laboratories are certified under the standards of the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments of 1988, or CLIA. CLIA requires specific policies and procedures regarding the collection, testing, and storage of specimens. CDC conducts research on human specimens. The research plans for this work include information about the procedures for the collection, testing, and storage of these specimens. To protect our collections, CDC's specimen archival storage facilities and containers consist of freezers at minus 70 degrees centigrade and liquid nitrogen containers that are monitored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with up to 3 responsible people to be notified in the case of an alarm that would indicate a problem with temperature control that could threaten the contents. To further guard some of our bacterial collection, CDC and the American Type Tissue Culture Collection, or ATCC, have a verbal agreement that new and reclassified strains of certain bacterial pathogens are placed into the ATCC collection so that organisms are available to from the ATCC to all scientists for purchase to use in their research. Specimens at CDC that are collected for the purpose of human research must comply with the basic HHS policy for protection of human research subjects. CDC investigators who collect and use human specimens are required to receive training in scientific ethics for investigators to engage in research using human subjects. Unless exempt by certain classifications identified in the Human Subjects Research Policy, all such research must be approved by an Institutional Review Board, IRB, prior to start of the research and specimen collection. IRB guidelines require that research protocols specify the disposition of remaining specimens after the completion of the research. The principal investigator must request permission from the participants via informed consent to store the remaining specimens for future use. In closing, CDC reference collections are a core component of our mission, unique in the world and absolutely critical to research in medicine and public health. Storage and subsequent disposal of specimens are carefully managed. These specimens provide the agency with the ability to not only detect, respond to, and control diseases today, but are vital to unraveling tomorrow's unexpected disease crises. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee to share this information with you about our invaluable specimen archives and our critical work in protecting public health. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Both of you gave testimony that was reassuring that your agency's your procedures for the disposition of scientific collections are done with some care and some thoughtfulness, some thought. Can you imagine, can you assure the subcommittee that a similar incident would not have occurred at your institution? Dr. Vaught.
Well, the NCI and the broader NIH has spent a lot of time the past few years trying to put policies into place to anticipate and manage collections in a way that they are collected, processed, and stored in an orderly way. And I believe the policy that's been most effective in this has been established within the last 2 years by the NIH in its intramural program that I mentioned, where IRB packages, Institutional Review Board packages, have to have a custodianship plan included for specimens and data. And when an investigator leaves NIH or otherwise something changes that causes the custodianship of the sample collection to change, then that has to be done in an orderly way. If the person goes outside NIH, then there are material transfer agreements that control transferring specimens and data outside of NIH. And if some change occurs within NIH, then there's agreement among various investigators to change the principal investigator who will lead and control the specimen. So that we believe we have those issues covered in that way.
Okay, Dr. Nicholson, would the CDC have destroyed collection in the circumstances that you've heard occurred here?
CDC has a similar approach to NIH in this regard. Quite honestly, the investigators at CDC have a very hard time removing any specimens from the collection, and it's a very difficult decision when that would happen.
Dr. Vaught, your testimony is that we need long-term plans for custodianship, really very standardized and excellent management practices. Many of the collections really are irreplaceable, priceless. And that other agencies need systems in place, procedures in place, protocols in place like what NCI has. Would a congressional directive to establish such policies and implement the policies throughout the various federal agencies that do such research help that goal?
Well, I think there's no easy answer to that. I think the basic principles that I laid out that NCI and NIH use are very good ones for custodianship of specimen collections. I believe, Mr. Chairman, you touched on in your earlier opening statement on the interagency issues, that the OSTP created this interagency working group on scientific collections, and we found in that group that I think it's something like only 35 or 40% of the agencies that reported have standard operating procedures and policies for managing long-term management of their collections. But we have to remember that scientific collections include not only the biological specimens that I mentioned for NIH, but also in my written testimony I mentioned the moon rock collections that NASA manages. For example, the Smithsonian artifacts from the Lewis and Clark expedition have to be managed, and these are all important collections for different reasons, so they would have differing management policies depending on the type of collection that's involved. So I think it would be difficult to write a policy that covers all the bases there, but I think it's probably something to be followed up with on this interagency working group.
Well, but biospecimens in particular, biobanking in particular, it does seem that they are somewhat different from the artifacts of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Would a directive from Congress to adopt a standard set of policies help making sure, which obviously has not happened, would it help that happen?
Well, I think we have to remember that there are already policies and regulations in place, including the federal regulations that govern informed consent for the Health and Human Services, and also the regulations and rules within NIH and other agencies that govern material transfer agreements. So you already have a basis for creating custodianship policies. So the question, I think, would be whether you go beyond the existing IRB and informed consent rules and regulations and the existing material transfer agreement regulations and create something that is beyond that. I think there are already good policies in place to handle most of these kinds of situations.
Are you aware of such policies at the VA?
Actually, I don't know. I know very little about the VA's policies. The informed consent policies that Dr. Nicholson and I operate under are governed by what's called the Common Rule, and that's an HHS regulation.
My time has expired. Mr. Rohrabacher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I take it that both of you knew that the major area that we were supposed to be looking at here today, the reason you're here, give us a broader image, a broader view as well, which you have, and I appreciate that. But I'd like to ask your opinion on this. I believe that, first of all, the research that was being conducted, which we now know was contributed greatly to saving human life, and admirable and positive research for the country and for the being of our people. Should that research have been VA research, or should it have been under NIH, CDC?
CDC does have a Legionella lab that does research. I don't know enough about what the VA's mission is to determine whether or not CDC should also do that type of research.
So the CDC would have actually could well have offered an alternative to encompassing this research and bringing them in. I'm not the Legionella expert, so I don't know what the focus of the research in our Legionella lab is, so I can't really say. All right. What about with the NIH?
Well, I think I'm even further removed from that. NIH has something like 26 or 27 institutes. One of them is the National Institute of Allergic and Infectious Diseases, NIAID. And they work closely, NIAID works closely with the CDC on infectious disease issues, but I couldn't say whether this would fall under NIAID's mission or not.
Okay. Were the people involved, and was the lab that's now being looked at? You've listened to the testimony, and I don't know if you read the testimony to come or not, but is it your professional opinions that the job that they were doing was met your professional standards? Organizations?
I honestly don't know enough about this situation to comment on that. I have, of course, read some of the testimony and background papers and so forth, but really my major conclusion was that this was an issue of custodianship, and so I've tried to address that from NCI and NIH's point of view, and hopefully those sorts of policies and procedures that we developed at NIH would be applied in other situations, but I
we're
really
talking about custodianship in a period of transition as well, because they were closing the lab, and who then, and what those procedures should be, and how to make sure situations don't arise like this, in which some very damaging decisions were made that ended up with the destruction of materials that could well have served us and served the lives of human beings in a very important way. And what would you say to that?
I don't really have any more to add. I also don't know any more than we just heard this morning about this particular case.
And have any of your organizations had run-ins with the administration like this before?
run-ins with our administration?
With people who are overseeing you within the administration for budgetary reasons, making decisions that could lead to a negative impact?
Well, I can only say from my own experience that there are policies and procedures developed at NIH for closing labs and an orderly transfer of equipment, materials, and personnel. Those decisions are made above my pay grade, but they happen.
So there are decisions that you think that are in place at NIH that would have prevented this destruction of these specimens?
I can only say that I believe that we have orderly processes in place at NIH. I can't comment on our situation.
How about CDC on this?
For the long-term collections, yes, that is absolutely the case, that there are policies and procedures in place to ensure that appropriate approvals are received in order to destroy specimens.
Well, I won't try to put you on the spot anymore because I understand the position you're in, but let's just, again, realize, like I stated in the beginning, there are bad decisions that are made by people. They should be held accountable. There's also bureaucratic problems that arise within a governmental approach to problems and governmental involvement in human activity. So try to find out what's at the bottom of this, but certainly people that have contributed enormously to the well-being of our people. I mean, Legionnaire's disease, it's a very admirable thing to have come up with some solution for that and something that can be treated. We end up with a situation like this, and I'm very pleased that Chairman chose to focus on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrbacher. Dr. Brown.
Thank you all for coming to this hearing today. As a physician, as a scientist, I'm very concerned about this issue, and just have a question of each of you. Do you see any reason, faint reason, compelling reason, from a scientific perspective, why these specimens should have been destroyed in the way that they were, from a safety perspective, a health perspective, or anything else? Can you see any reason to have just destroyed these specimens the way that they were handled? And I'd like both of you to comment on that, please.
Well, again, I feel like as a scientist that I really don't know all the facts in this case to make that sort of judgment. I can tell you that in our experience at NIH, there are a number of reasons that specimen collections would be destroyed after a long and careful process of reviewing their utility. Normally, they would be destroyed if they are no longer useful for their original purpose, there isn't enough sample left to do any further work on, or if they presented some other sort of biohazard may be one reason, but usually those biohazard issues can be mitigated by regulations that are in place at NIH and CDC. So I just have to say that a lot of thought is given into destroying specimen collections, and as Dr. Nicholson stated, usually the problem is getting investigators to let go of their specimens because the tendency is to want to save them as long as possible, and that's why we have huge warehouses full of freezers out in Frederick, Maryland.
Dr. Nicholson.
I also don't know enough about this particular case. I will tell you, I don't have a whole lot more to add over what Dr. Vaught has said, but within CDC, it would be very rare for a specimen collection to be destroyed. I'm not aware of any of that. It's not all that unusual for specimens as part of collections to be destroyed because of a variety of reasons that you may understand and that I had already outlined.
Certainly, as a practicing physician, I don't anticipate my own patients' specimens to be continued just on an ongoing basis. Once I get the clinical information I need as a practicing doctor, I make those clinical decisions that I make, and then I don't expect those decisions. But also, valuable research is absolutely critical for antibiotic development and to find about pathogens changing their response to various antimicrobials, et cetera. And so I can't imagine as a scientist just destroying a whole set of specimens just without any regard, particularly those that are involved in patient care and patient evaluation prior to having a determination about what the final results of that culture might be. In each of y'all's opinion, is destroying a specimen prior to developing the identification and antibiotic sensitivities to clinical specimens, is there? To me, this seems to be just totally beyond comprehension. Can you see any compelling reason to destroy those when you have an ongoing process for clinical specimens on patients or environmental sources of those specimens prior to the determination of what the pathogen, well, whether there's a pathogen there, what the pathogen might be, and anything to help in determining how to deal with that pathogen at that point?
For clinical laboratories, and CDC does do reference diagnostic testing primarily for the state public health laboratories. We have to abide by CLIA, and every CLIA laboratory has written procedures and protocols about the collection and the use and the storage of such specimens. Specimens, before they actually have been evaluated to determine what might be the causative agent, may be actually rejected because they appear to CDC in such poor condition. They were exposed to high temperatures. There are other physical reasons for specimens to have never reached the testing component after they have been collected.
But at this point, again, just for the record's sake, when that determination is made, it's because of inadequacy of collection materials, or that the media has a problem with it or something else. It's
Exactly.
not because it's a valid specimen that could be utilized in that investigation. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Dr. Vaught,
Yeah,
do you have anything to add?
I don't think so. My experience at the Cancer Institute is not in infectious diseases, so our specimens are collected for example clinical trials and epidemiology studies where cancer biomarkers are studied. And usually, always, there's a study protocol where it's determined what the specimens are going to be used for. how long they're going to be saved, at their primary hypotheses, secondary hypotheses. When all of those are exhausted, then consideration will be given usually to sharing any additional specimens that are left over with investigators outside of NIH or colleagues within NIH. So discarding a sample collection is usually the last resort when it's no longer useful, or there could be some circumstances where specimens are no longer useful or they are not in good condition to be used, but those would be, as I said, as a last resort.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. I think we have no further questions of this panel. Thank you very much for being here, and we will now take about a 15-minute break before the final panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll wait just a minute or two for Mr. Warbacher. We understand he's coming back. We are back. I would now like to introduce our final panel today. Mr. Michael Moreland is the Director of the Veterans Integrated Service Network 4 at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Dr. Mona Melhem is the Associate Chief of Staff and Vice President of the Clinical Support Service Line for the Veterans Affairs Pittsburgh Healthcare System. Dr. Ali Sonnell is the Associate Chief of Staff for the Veterans Affairs Pittsburgh Healthcare System. Dr. Stephen Graham is the Director of the Geriatric Research, Education, and Clinical Centers at the Veterans Affairs Pittsburgh Healthcare System. And Ms. Cheryl Wanzi is the Chief Technologist for the Veterans Affairs Pittsburgh System. Dr. Sonnell is the Associate Chief of Staff for Research, specifically at the Veterans Affairs Pittsburgh Healthcare System. I understand that only Mr. Moreland will be giving prepared testimony today, but the other witnesses will answer questions that may be directed to them.
Actually, sir, each of the witnesses does have an oral statement.
Oh, all right. We will take the oral statement. We did not get anything in writing beforehand, but what? Okay. All right. That's fine. We do take as you know from seeing the earlier two panels, we do take testimony under oath. Do any of you have an objection to being sworn in, to swearing an oath? All the witnesses nodded their head that they had no problem, no objection. The committee also provides that you may be represented by counsel. Do any of you have counsel with you at the hearing today? All the witnesses nodded or said that they did not have counsel. If you now please stand and raise your right hand. You swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? All of the witnesses said or otherwise? Or all the witnesses are now so sworn. Mr. Moreland, you may begin.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the events surrounding the closure of the Special Pathogens Laboratory at the VA Pittsburgh Healthcare System. I am joined today by several colleagues from the VA Pittsburgh Healthcare System, including Dr. Ali Sonnell, our Associate Chief of Research and Development, Dr. Mona Melhem, our Vice President, Clinical Support Service Line, Ms. Cheryl Wanzi, Medical Technologist, and Dr. Steve Graham, Director, Geriatric Research and Education Center. And, sir, I assume our written testimonies will all be entered for the record.
Mr. Moreland, I believe that only you have submitted written testimony. It will be submitted in full in the record.
Thank you very much. Today we will address the closure of the Special Pathogens Lab, the disposition of equipment and specimens, and the VA policies as they were in December of 2006. Additionally, I will discuss some changes that we have made and instituted in policy since that time. In January of 2006, the Associate Chief of Staff for Clinical Support, who oversees all of Pittsburgh's laboratory functions, conducted a standard review of the Special Pathogens Lab workload. This review determined that the main clinical laboratory would be more efficiently managing these duties. It also revealed that the Special Pathogens Lab was acting beyond its intended scope. The lab lacked a defined and approved research activity, and the volume of clinical work being performed was very low. These, plus other concerns, led us to conclude that the Special Pathogens Lab would be moved into the main clinical lab, and that additional reviews of the lab's research accounts would be necessary. The Special Pathogens Lab closed on July 21, 2006. Approximately 2 weeks earlier, on July the 5th, the director of the lab was notified via email and in person about the lab's closure, and he and his staff were given 2 weeks to complete work currently in process. This notification included instructions to stop accepting specimens from external customers. The lab's closeout plans were forwarded to the lab's staff on July the 7th, and formal letters of notification were delivered on July the 10th. The members of the lab received clear direction regarding labeling of existing and new specimens and stored samples, and the members of the lab were told to provide a map for this storage. These orders were specific, but they were ignored. As the medical center director, I initiated an administrative board of investigation to review research and financial activities. The administrative board determined that the lab was operating outside of its established scope of services and had evolved into an unauthorized commercial enterprise, testing samples for private companies including hotels, restaurants, and gas stations. It was also engaged in subcontracting for private environmental companies. The lab had a commercial client list well into the hundreds. In September of 2006, we conducted a review of every publication generated in the lab and concluded that studies involving human subjects were conducted without required approval from the Institutional Review Board and/or the Research and Development Committee. To our knowledge, no individuals were harmed as a result of this research. We reported these findings to the VA Office of Research Oversight in October of 2006. They concluded we had adequately addressed research noncompliance by preventing the lab from any future research projects, eventually closing the lab, and establishing safeguards to prevent similar noncompliance in the future. Following the lab's closure, all properly labeled and cataloged clinical specimens were moved to the main lab. Research specimens associated with an approved research protocol, properly labeled and maintained by the principal investigator, were transferred to the main clinical lab for storage as well. Any specimens that were either not labeled or not cataloged or properly sealed were considered biohazardous material and were safely disposed of in accordance with hazardous material procedures to safeguard patient care and public health. VA Pittsburgh water samples were transferred to the clinical laboratory and were sent to an outside vendor for Legionella testing subsequent to the lab's closure. VHA policy in December of 2006 clearly stated that if an investigator leaves a VA facility, the original research records must be retained at the institution. Moreover, VA policy instructed that records and information collected and created by VA personnel in the conduct of official business belong to the federal government and not to the employee who initiated the collection or the creation. We determined that the samples in question were not properly labeled and cataloged and did not constitute a sample of collection. Even if the samples had been properly labeled and stored, the collection could not have been banked at a non-VA institution without proper approval. Following this incident, VA Pittsburgh Healthcare System has adopted new policy. On October 19, 2007, we issued Research Data Security and Privacy Policy that specifically outlines processes for disposition of research and clearly informs researchers that VA research is the property of VA and that investigators cannot take the collection away from the VA without appropriate approval. VA Pittsburgh Healthcare System operates a robust research program committed to contributing to science and enhancing care to veterans in the broader community. We've added compliance staff to increase research oversight, and leadership is continuing an ongoing in-depth review to ensure all VA researchers adhere to the highest level of human subjects protection. That concludes my statement, Mr. Chairman.
All right, we do not have written testimony from any of the other witnesses, but I understand each of you wishes to give oral testimony, so why don't we just go down the line. Dr. Sonnell.
Good morning, or good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I would like to thank you for providing this opportunity to discuss the events surrounding the disposal of various samples from the now closed Special Pathogens Laboratory at the VA Pittsburgh Healthcare System. I'm Dr. Eli Sonnell, and I'm the Director of the Cardiac Catheterization Laboratories and the Associate Chief of Staff for Research and Development. To provide some context, VA-PHS is home to one of the largest research programs in the nation with over $24 million in annual research expenditures and 276 active research protocols, including 165 human research participant protocols conducted by 120 investigators. Fostering scientific research and ensuring the safety, rights, and welfare of research participants through compliance with local, state, and national regulatory requirements for protection of human subjects are critical to our mission of serving America's veterans. In September 2006, I became the ACOS for research. Prior to this time, I was not involved with the closure of the Special Pathogens Lab. The Special Pathogens Lab Director did not contact me to request a transfer of any biological samples or specimens. The only request I received for transferring any specimens or samples was made by another member of the Special Pathogens Lab staff in October of 2006. This researcher inquired about potentially transferring biological isolates derived from human subjects and related environmental samples, referencing an earlier discussion with the prior ACOS for research. After discussing this request with the Chief of Staff, I asked the researcher to present us with any required paperwork for such a transfer. In order to better understand the request, I also asked our Research Compliance Office to determine what items specifically were being requested for transfer, their condition, and whether or not such a transfer would be permitted by existing regulations. However, I did not receive any formal paperwork or materials transfer agreements. A meeting was arranged at the end of November between the VA-PHS Research Education and Compliance Coordinator and Special Pathogens Lab staff members, so the Special Pathogens Lab staff could identify and catalog the samples and specimens in question. This meeting was scheduled for December 5, 2006. On December 4, I sent an email to the Chief of Staff to confirm that there were no administrative barriers for this meeting to take place. The Chief of Staff responded positively and included the ACOS for clinical support on the email string to confirm. The ACOS for clinical support indicated at 3:09 p.m. on December 4th that the freezers containing the samples were cleaned out and the freezers were returned. Chief of Staff concluded that there were no materials left for the Special Pathogens Lab staff to review and suggested that they be directed to the ACOS for clinical support if they had any further questions regarding the samples. At that point, I asked the Research Education and Compliance Coordinator to cancel the meeting with the Special Pathogens Lab staff and directed them to the ACOS for clinical support for any further inquiries. There were no policies specific to VA-PHS as of December 4, 2006 with regard to disposition of tissue or data repositories in a situation where the investigator is no longer authorized to conduct research. VHA Handbook 1200.5 stipulates that if an investigator leaves a VA facility, the original research records must be retained at the institution. VHA Handbook 6300.1 further notes the records and information collected and created by VA personnel in the conduct of official business belong to the federal government and not to the employees who initiated their collection or creation. On October 19, 2007, VA-PHS Research Data Security and Privacy Policy was issued, outlining local policies regarding the security of research information. This policy, which was written based upon guidance provided by the Office of Research Oversight and the Office of Research and Development, clearly states that VHA research data belongs to the VA. The policy describing our procedures related to the disposition of research collections states that any data to be retained, reused, or shared for future studies must be housed in a data repository, and that the creation of the repository requires the development of policies and procedures that must be approved by the VA-PHS IRB and the Research and Development Committee. VA-PHS is currently developing a comprehensive policy addressing the handling and disposition of research data and collections, including situations where the investigator's appointment was terminated, or in cases where research data or specimens were collected without proper regulatory approvals, thus constituting serious noncompliance. Thank you again for your time, Mr. Chairman. I'm prepared to answer any questions.
Dr. Melham. You need to turn your microphone on.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Dr. Mona Melhem. I'm the Associate Chief of Staff for Clinical Support at the VA Pittsburgh. I'm also a professor of pathology at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. I have been a practicing physician and pathologist to the Department of Veteran Affairs in Pittsburgh since 1986. And I did rise through additional clinical special qualifications. I'm a board certified in anatomic and clinical pathology and hematopathology, and have published more than 150 peer-reviewed articles and published abstracts of research presented at national and international conferences. For the past 22 years, I've taken on greater clinical and administrative responsibilities within the pathology and lab medicine services at the VA. And I began my current position as Associate Chief of Staff and Vice President of Clinical Support since 2001. In this capacity, I'm responsible for pathology and lab medicine, including the clinical microbiology and special pathogens lab. In January 2006, acting in my oversight capacity, I requested a routine review of the clinical productivity and financial expenditure of the special pathogens lab. This lab was chartered in the 1980s as a clinical resource for VA. The lab was to be financially independent and to serve the clinical needs of the VA Pittsburgh healthcare system and other VA medical centers in what was then an emerging field of Legionella testing. Based on this review, it was clear the lab was not productive and was a drain on clinical resource. This led me to the decision to consolidate the special pathogens lab functions into the main clinical microbiology labs in the main building. Of note, the chief of infectious disease by law cannot be also named administratively chief of microbiology lab, as this constitutes a conflict of interest and self-referral of any specimens that go to this lab. In preparation for the lab's closing, I ordered lab personnel to move all recognizable, cataloged, and well-marked intact tubes and specimens to the main laboratories to ensure the patient's confidentiality and the specimen's integrity. There were several efforts to enlist the cooperation of the then director of the Special Pathogens Lab, but to no avail. Upon the Special Pathogens Director's departure, we found a freezer filled with unidentified biological materials and microorganisms. There was simply no way of knowing the specimen's risk or danger to the public. Special pathogens are infectious agents that produce serious disease in humans. And so, in July 2006, and in the interest of public safety and the health of our veterans, we requested the Vice Presidents of Facility Management to coordinate the disposal of hazardous material and the immediate cleaning of the special pathogens lab. These steps were consistent with established procedures and guidelines followed by both public and private laboratories across the world, which dictate that unknown remaining specimens must be disposed of as soon as possible. I was also aware of any effort. I was not aware of any effort by the staff of the Special Pathogens Lab to transfer any samples to qualified labs at the University of Pittsburgh. Sometimes around September 06, roughly 1 month after the closure of the lab, I had an informal conversation with the Associate Chief of Staff for Research and Development about the specimens that were preserved after the lab closure. I stated at that time that we preserved specimens we knew to be part of an approved research protocol or were otherwise able to identify. well-labeled, well-cataloged specimens from other investigators were moved to the main clinical lab under specific strict freezing conditions to maintain their integrity. On December 4th, I asked lab personnel about the status of the remaining sample, knowing then that it had been destroyed and taken care of sometimes between July and September. Based on my earlier instruction, I believe they had already been properly destroyed. I was informed there may be some biohazard material remaining in Building 2 where the Special Pathogens lab was located. Since this lab had been closed since July of 2006, I ordered an extensive cleaning and disposal process of all remaining unidentifiable, broken, or abandoned tubes. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my statement. I'm prepared for any.
Dr. Graham.
Thank you. My name is Stephen Graham, and I'm the director of the Geriatric Research, Educational, and Clinical Center at VA Pittsburgh Healthcare System, and I'm professor of neurology at the University of Pittsburgh. My own research program concerns the mechanisms of neuronal cell death and is funded by the National Institute of Health and the Department of Veterans Affairs. I served as Associate Chief of Staff for Research at VA Pittsburgh Healthcare System from July 2002 until September 2006. I'm prepared to discuss my involvement and knowledge of the Special Pathogens Lab's closing and related issues. In March 2006, I participated in a meeting with the senior VA Pittsburgh leadership regarding the Special Pathogens Lab. At that meeting, serious questions were raised about the lab's lack of peer-reviewed research grants and whether approved research was being conducted in the laboratory. There were also questions about the extent to which the lab's activities supported veterans' health care. In April 2006, I met with the Special Pathogens Lab's director and VA Pittsburgh senior leadership to discuss these concerns. At the meeting, the lab director was asked to provide a list of institutions and companies for whom the lab was performing studies, the number of VA studies, and a list of all research studies approved by the Institutional Review Board. We asked the lab director to comply with the requirements for IRB and R&D committee review of his research program. The VA-PHS director directed that an audit be conducted of the lab's accounts in the Veterans Research Foundation of Pittsburgh. I understand that the hospital director later decided to close the Special Pathogens Laboratory, although I did not participate in any meetings where this was discussed. The results of this foundation financial audit and a review of additional documents by the Research Service suggested the strong likelihood that the lab had conducted research without prior approval from an IRB or the Research and Development Committee. The VA-PHS Director and the Office of Research Oversight, ORO, were informed of these concerns. The VA-PHS Director convened a Board of Investigation on which I served. I referred this matter to the VA-PHS Research Compliance Committee for further investigation and action. In July 2006, I met with the director of the hospital, the chief of staff, and the research administrative officer regarding the lab's closure. The concern was raised that there might be biohazardous material in the lab that could constitute a safety hazard. The director asked the research administrative officer and me to address this problem. To the best of my knowledge, the research administrative officer and the biosafety officer subsequently entered the laboratories and disposed of all cultures still growing in incubators, as well as biological agents and chemicals stored in 4-degree refrigerators. Specimens kept in the -70 freezers were not disposed of at that time. In August of 2006, I was contacted by a former Special Pathogens Lab staff scientist and the director of the Special Pathogens Lab regarding the possible transfer of equipment and reference specimens from the lab. I informed the Special Pathogens Lab director that equipment bought by the Veterans Foundation of Pittsburgh remains the property of the foundation, and regulations allow that equipment to be transferred only to another VA or VA foundation. I informed that it would be difficult or impossible to transfer any human specimens, but it might be possible to transfer bacterial specimens to another institution. This would require a materials transfer agreement that must be endorsed by the accepting institution and approved by the VA-PHS administration. At that time, the new laboratory was not operational, so I considered it premature to consider this issue further. I did communicate this desire to transfer the specimens to the Research Administrative Officer. I have no direct knowledge of the destruction of specimens on December 4th, 2006. At the request of the subcommittee, I've also been asked to comment on the efforts of a schizophrenia researcher who left VA Pittsburgh in 1995 to transfer specimens to another institution. In 1998 and 2000, requests were submitted to my predecessor as ACOS for research to transfer human cerebrospinal fluid and blood specimens that were obtained under an improved IRB protocol to another institution. The ACOS for research eventually denied that request upon the advice of VA Regional Counsel and the VA's Office of Research and Development. The transfer request was not compatible with VHA Directive 2000-043 regarding the banking of human research specimens. Another investigator at VA-PHS agreed to take custody of these samples, and they remain at the hospital to this date. This concludes my statement. I'm prepared to answer any questions the subcommittee may have.
Ms. Wanzig.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Cheryl Wanzig. I am an American Society of Clinical Pathologists registered medical technologist since 1971. I've been employed with the Department of Veterans Affairs since 1973. My current position is Chief Medical Technologist, Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at the VA Pittsburgh Healthcare System. I was responsible for overseeing the quality of the process for clinical testing of samples from VA patients performed by the Special Pathogens Laboratory and ensuring that the laboratory met the standards for laboratory accreditation. I was and am currently responsible for allocating the clinical laboratory supply budget and monitoring associated workload data. In January 2006, I provided workload and cost data for the Special Pathogens Lab to Dr. Mona Malham, Associate Chief of Lab, Clinical Support Service. After reviewing the data and obtaining other information, Dr. Malham determined that the Special Pathogens Lab clinical environmental testing workload could be performed more efficiently in the clinical microbiology laboratory. Dr. Malham asked me to facilitate and oversee the transition of the clinical and environmental Legionella testing to the main laboratory. In June 2006, Dr. Malham informed me that the Special Pathogens Laboratory would close in July and that the clinical microbiology laboratory would assume both clinical and environmental Legionella testing. On the morning of July 19, 2006, Dr. Malham, a VA-PHS research scientist, and I met with a staff member for the Special Pathogens Lab.
Ms. Wanzig, can you pull the microphone closer? Apparently the recorder is having a hard time hearing.
On the morning of July 19, 2006, Dr. Malham, a VA-PHS research scientist, and I met with a staff member of the Special Pathogens Lab to discuss the transfer of clinical and environmental specimens and clinical laboratory equipment from the Special Pathogens Lab to the main laboratory. Dr. Malham instructed the Special Pathogens Lab staff to consolidate all clinical and environmental specimens in a clinical refrigerator and specimens belonging to other research scientists in a clinical ultra-low freezer, which would be moved to the main laboratory that afternoon. Special Pathogens Lab was also instructed to prepare an inventory of the clinical environmental specimens, which they never provided. In the afternoon, Dr. Malham and I supervised the transfer of the equipment and appropriately labeled clinical specimens from the Special Pathogens Lab to the main laboratory. At that time, VA-PHS research scientist specimens were secured in an ultra-low freezer in the main laboratory. The remaining specimens were left in the Special Pathogens Lab, which closed on July 21st, 2006. In the afternoon of December 4th, 2006, Dr. Mellum inquired if there were specimens remaining in the Special Pathogens Lab. I responded that to my knowledge they were still in the Special Pathogens Lab. Dr. Mellum informed me that the medical center director considered this to be a concern due to the presence of biohazardous material and directed that the refrigerators and freezers be cleaned out by the end of the day. I assembled some of the microbiology staff, and we proceeded to remove all improperly labeled or uncatalogued specimens from the Special Pathogens Lab using standard biohazardous waste protocols. I cautioned the staff to take extra precautions because some of the specimens were uncapped and in broken glass tubes. Specimens were placed in double biohazard bags, removed from the building, placed in biohazard waste containers to be removed from the facility by a contractor. In my position as chief technologist, I had no knowledge of any policies in effect on December 4, 2006 concerning the disposition of research collections. I am now aware of a VA-PHS research data security and privacy policy which ensures the protection of private information and the disposition of research material. Thank you. That concludes my statement. I'm prepared to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. I understand that all of you have given statements, have been interviewed by the subcommittee staff. That's correct, isn't it? You can just nod your head. All of you remember it. I assume it would be an event that you would remember. And do any of you now recall differently any event that you talked to our staff about? Do any of you wish to correct anything that you told our staff?
Sir,
Mr. Moreland?
The only thing I would say is I don't remember every single word that I said to the committee
Right.
staff, so it'd be very difficult to assert
Well,
that
I understand.
today.
I'm not talking about every single word, but you do you remember the gist of anything that you said differently now from what do you recall saying something to the staff that you now believe you now recall differently?
Not of significant content. I don't. Again, I'm not trying to be argumentative.
Okay,
sir.
well,
I'm just saying that it was a few weeks ago, and we had.
I understand that nobody is going to remember every word that you
conversations.
said, but you know the gist of what you told our staff. Do any of you now recall differently anything that you told our staff? Dr. Sennell?
No, I do not recall anything different.
Dr. Mellon?
I do not.
Dr. Graham? Ms. Wanzi?
I do not.
Okay. All of you did not submit written testimony in advance, but all of you read verbatim from written testimony. Obviously, it would have been helpful to this committee to prepare for the hearing to have had that testimony in advance, and all of you obviously made a conscious decision not to provide written testimony. Dr. Sennell, did anyone talk with you about whether you would provide written testimony in advance?
I was told that we could prepare oral statements and that they would be.
Well, but you read verbatim from a written statement. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
I just saw you do it. Why did you decide not to provide that statement in advance to the committee, which obviously would have been our preference?
We were working with the central office, and
I'm not sure if your microphone is on or it's close enough to you.
we were working with the VA central office, and they were assisting us in the submission process. So I relied on them to submit.
Okay. Who read your written testimony?
Ms. Lansendorfer, I believe, from the VA.
Okay. Anyone else?
Legislative Affairs. I'm not sure if it was circulated to other people, but it was made clear that it was our own. It was to be our own statement.
Did she make any suggested changes in your testimony?
No material changes.
Did you talk to any of the other witnesses today about your testimony?
I shared my planned statement with them. Yes.
Did you see their statements?
I did.
All right. Dr. Mellon?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Did you see anyone else's statements?
I did see Mr. Moreland's.
And well, how about Dr. Snell, Dr. Graham, Ms.
I
Wanzi?
did not read any of.
Okay. Did you provide your written statement to anyone else?
I did send it to Ms.
All right. Mr. Moreland, who saw your statement in advance?
I submitted to Congressional Affairs like we usually do in central office, and they saw it. And then I know that I've read the testimony in front of the people here on the committee panel so that we're aware of each other's statements.
Okay. Yes, you were about to say something else.
But there wasn't direction from either of us about what to say. It was simply sharing the statement so we could make sure that what the other one was saying.
Dr. Graham?
Yes, I submitted my a draft of my oral statement as requested VA Legal Affairs. They counseled us not to say anything about impending personnel actions because that might violate the Privacy Act, and I actually recall that they asked Mr. Moreland to redact some of his oral statements because they might not be appropriate for a statement.
All right, Ms. Wanzi?
I was asked to provide a oral statement in written form to VA Central Office. I received some responses back, some questions about my statement. I did not make any substantive changes to my statement. I did read statements from the rest of the panel.
One of the, Ms. Wanzi, one of the people, perhaps it was you, who who dumped the vials into the biohazard bags and took them to be incinerated, said that the vials were labeled with, or had both numbers and letters on them. Is that correct? Was that you that said that?
I said that.
What?
Yes, I said that.
Okay. All right. Mr. Moreland, you heard the testimony of the first panel. I assume that Dr. Snydman and both Dr. Stout and Dr. Yu said that those letters and numbers actually matched up to a catalog, and Ms. Stout attached a catalog or appended a catalog to her testimony. What is the basis for your statement that they were not cataloged?
My basis was that I had never seen the catalog and that despite numerous requests, it was not provided. The VA catalog actually is VA property, so if
Did you ask Dr. Stout for a catalog?
I did not personally.
I did on several occasions, including in one of the emails.
Okay.
Despite having asked for the catalog, it was not provided, and so without the presence of a catalog, one cannot ascertain what the numbering system means. And so by the lack of provision, it becomes a catalog system that is not cataloged because it wasn't provided. And I wanted to make clear, as I was starting to say, the catalog actually is the property of the organization. So that catalog, if it has been removed from the VA and is in the presence of a non-VA employee and is not provided to the organization, that's a significant concern to me, sir, because it may have private information that is not available to the public and should not be. And so despite request, it was not provided.
Dr. Moreland, did you look on her computer?
I did not look on her computer. It was requested to be provided, and so it could have been emailed, it could have been provided in written copy. And I'll mention, sir, that there were two other significant research projects going on in that building. When we asked them to provide a catalog of their samples, it was provided the same day. So that we easily had the catalog, we had the samples labeled. We were able to take those labeled catalog samples and move them properly to the clinical laboratory. That was not possible to do with the Special Pathogens Lab because they did not provide the requested catalog.
All right, Mr. Moreland, you said in your written testimony that, and your oral, that there was a technical review of that found that the research specimens presented a potential biohazard to both employees and our veterans. Was that technical review in writing?
I'll have to defer that question to Dr. Melham.
Sir, my technical review was mostly concerned with the clinical specimens. And the clinical specimens in a clinical lab can only remain up to 2 weeks after testing of the clinical specimen.
Right, but we're now
and
talking
should
about
have been destroyed at that time.
We're talking about the research specimens. Was there a technical review that the research I mean, that certainly is the implication of this testimony.
Well, again, what I would say is that, as Dr. Melham mentioned, if you have samples in a freezer and samples that are not identified, I don't know what they are. I don't know what they could be.
But you use the term technical review, and that was all oral. It was around the water cooler. It wasn't in writing. There wasn't any, no scrap of paper generated as a result of this technical review.
That's correct.
I'm
No,
sorry, my time is
the technical review regarding whether it was a biohazard is done basically with the clinical staff, and they went overlooked, and so there was not a technical review in writing.
All right, my time has expired for this round. Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Dr. Melham. You have responsibility, it says clinical support services. Do you have any responsibilities for overseeing research?
No, I don't.
So you would not have known any of this information anyway, would you?
Sir, the information I got is the specimen that were in the
You would not have known
freezers.
about the research information.
The information I had is that the specimens that were kept in the freezer had patients' identifications, including first initial and 4 letters of the Social
But
Security.
you had no idea that what type of research that this dealt
Sir,
with.
I am a researcher.
I know.
And
but
I've
that's
been
not
a
your
researcher for
responsibility.
many years.
That is not your responsibility.
That is not
it?
my responsibility,
Good.
but
So-
I know a collection when I see a collection.
You know a collection, and you spent a lot of time in their lab?
I
trying
did
to
spend
familiarize
time
you?
looking through the freezers and asked several times of the director who is
How
actually
much
answering
time
to
did you
me.
spend looking through their freezer?
Well, I looked at the freezers. I determined what belonged to the catalogs that we had and what did not belong.
How much time did you spend, was the question?
Well, I was
An
in
hour?
the freezer a couple
1 hour?
of times.
2 hours? Or are we talking about 30 minutes or 15 minutes?
Probably a couple of times, a half hour or an hour
A couple of
each.
times for half an hour. Thank you. When I was a young reporter, I worked for a news organization that hired me to go to press conferences and rewrite statements by politicians, rewriting their press releases and supposedly covering the news. And I took it upon myself to actually go out and investigate some stories on my own. I never had any appreciation from my bosses for the public service that I was actually providing by investigating corruption in our city. Because that wasn't their job. Their job was to rewrite press releases and fill copy. Excuse me if I don't notice the same sort of lack of appreciation. Have any of you, and you're all doctors and researchers and such, have any of you had the accomplishment of finding the source of a bacteria that was causing thousands of people or risking thousands of people to lose their lives? Have any of you reached that plateau yet in your career? Or is it that you're just looking through the refrigerators of people who are involved with that type of activity? I said earlier that we in Washington, we have to deal with a lot of bureaucratic problems. I certainly identify today, after your testimony, that we've got a bureaucratic attitude problem. Someone didn't ask permission, and this is my area. Listen, I've got to tell you, this is I can totally identify with what's going on. I know I can sense the personality problems that arose when someone didn't ask permission. I'll have to tell you, Dr. Moreland, you're complaining that they have a commercial client group of people that they complained? They're servicing the health needs of certain people in the community. You think that's something to complain about? They were offering a service to identify a deadly bacteria to the community. Is that what you're complaining about?
Well, sir, what I would respond to that is that The VA has a very specific mission to take care of veterans.
That's right.
And there are multiple commercial laboratories
Like I
that
said,
do the exact same
Again,
testing.
you're talking about the bureaucratic lines, and you're upset that the bureaucratic lines were stepped upon by these people. Now,
Yes,
by
sir.
the way, they may well have not been, they've been out of the borders. I understand that. And I understand your job is to make sure this thing runs smoothly. Take a look at the bigger picture here. What you're thinking of is a rogue element of scientists looking in through their microscopes without permission. The rest of us may look at it and say, hey, my uncle was saved because of what this lady did. I will have to tell you, I think this type of bureaucratic attitude comes with the job. I'm not blaming you as individuals. You've been given a responsibility to try to make a huge organization and a huge budget make it work. And I understand that, and I respect that. I think that when people have that type of responsibility, quite often they can't see the forest for the trees of what the purpose of all of this is. It's to save people's lives, trying to make the world a little better, and these aren't rogues. These are people trying to do a good job, and certainly you can reply to that, and I'll shut up after that. Go right ahead, Dr. Moreland.
No, sir, I was simply going to say it wasn't that it upset me or it angered me. It was that it was not appropriate use of government funds and government work. And there are multiple private sector groups that do the exact same testing, and I don't think that it's my place to compete with these private sector companies to do referral lab services. And so we are constituting our work to make sure that the clinical work of the VA and our patients are taken care of. And I hope Dr. Yu well in his private endeavor.
Thank you. Mr. Moreland, I'm sure you've read the staff report on all this. The staff report found that the Research Foundation gave express approval in 1995 to do fee-for-service testing for Legionella. Is that an incorrect finding?
It's an incorrect interpretation. And so
what do you mean? What's the distinction that you're making?
Are you referencing the July 5th memo that you've provided?
Yes.
Yes. That is a discussion that went along about doing fee-for-service work for other VA hospitals. And in the memo, if you look, there's a term that's used that makes that pretty clear when it talks about in the third paragraph, the last sentence, it says services provided to other VA medical centers can be paid on the expenditure transfer. Well, this was about providing services to other VA hospitals and other systems in the VA, and they were doing that. And in fact, the VA Pittsburgh continues to provide those kind of services to other VA hospitals who are sending their Legionella samples to the VA Pittsburgh, and Dr. Melham in the clinical lab is indeed processing those. This was really about that. And I'll also mention it was 1995, and it's 2008 today, and things do change on occasion.
Did you get word that the approval had been revoked?
The approval was internal to the VA Pittsburgh.
I'm sorry, what?
The approval was internal to the VA Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
And so so that approval can be changed internal to the VA Pittsburgh.
Was it?
Well, since I was the hospital director, I would have made that decision. So what I was looking at.
Did you?
Yes, I did, sir.
Did you do that in writing?
I informed Dr. Yu and others that I was concerned that we were taking samples from 600 companies across the United States, some of them outside of the United States. We were processing them and charging a fee. Those fees were not covering the cost of what was going on. That seemed to me to be an inappropriate use of VA funds and VA services, and so it was better that we not do that business.
Mr. Moreland, did you direct anyone to destroy the collection? You told our staff earlier you did not recall doing that.
My memory is, as I think I said to the staff, is that in July I had been very clear. I wanted any samples or identified collections that included labeling and mapping, that those samples should be moved in whole over to the clinical lab and stored properly, and anything left would be disposed of as excess. And I thought that's what happened in July. And so when Dr. Melhelm went to the other two researchers and asked for their catalog and got them, those samples were moved. Frankly, I didn't know what had happened to the samples constituted there, because I assumed that they either were moved as a collection because a mapping and a system was provided, or they were disposed of, as would have been the case with leftover samples.
Were you aware of the continuing discussions about transferring the sample?
I don't recall being aware of that until December.
Okay,
when
Dr.
I saw
Sennell,
an email.
were you part of those discussions?
Yes, as I indicated in October by email, Dr. Stout contacted me, and I made some preliminary arrangements to explore that request further, and that's why I got the Research Compliance Office involved.
Okay, and when did you find out that the collections had been destroyed?
That was on December 4th, around afternoon, when I emailed my supervisor, our Chief of Staff, regarding the planned meeting between the Special Pathogens Lab staff and
What time of day was that?
I believe that was around 3:09 p.m. is when I emailed our Chief of Staff.
That you found out they had been destroyed?
Shortly after that, within a few minutes, when he responded and
at that point, did
and
you have an
included-
agreement to transfer the collection?
No, we actually, Dr. Stout and I had communicated on email that we would require materials transfer agreements, and I suggested to her that the recipient lab should initiate the paperwork. But I was never presented any paperwork for me to review to consider the transfer further. And part of the intent of the meeting was for the Special Pathogens Lab to provide paperwork, identify what they were talking about, and identify what they had desire to transfer and what condition they were in.
Do you have any idea what Dr. Mellon knew about the discussions for the transfer of the collection?
I actually want to clarify one thing that Dr. Stout indicated during her testimony that is factually inaccurate. She indicated that Dr. Mellon and I had a discussion about her intent to dispose of any materials or samples, and we've never had such a discussion. So the first that I heard about the disposal was December 4th, or the intent to dispose was December 4th.
I'm sorry, I don't think that your answer actually provided an answer to the question I asked. Did you talk to Dr. Mellon about your negotiations to transfer the collection?
Not during the negotiations themselves.
When did you? Did you at another time?
Well, when I first took over and we were going over research space, I do remember Dr. Mellon showing a freezer that was a remnant or residual of the Special Pathogens Laboratory in one of the research areas. And at that point, I thought we briefly discussed that potentially getting those out of there by properly de-identifying those samples and specimens. That was a verbal discussion, and I do not recall all the details of it. But during the email communication between Dr. Stout and myself, we did not have any discussions with Dr. Mellon at that time. My discussions were directed towards my supervisor.
Just 1 second, please. Dr. Sennell, do you remember sending an email to Rajiv Jain?
Dr. Jain is our Chief of Staff.
On the day after the destruction of the vials, I think, Tuesday, December 5th. Or was it the same day? Next day. You remember sending an email?
I do remember communicating with Dr. J multiple times by email during that time. I don't remember the specific email.
Well, let me read this one to you. I appreciate,
Number 5.
it's number 5 in your book. Please send it in the way.
Yes, I do have it here.
Okay. Dr. Jane, I appreciate your support and clarification. I'm a bit disappointed that I was not given an opportunity to process this through the RCC. What's the RCC?
That's our Research Compliance Committee.
Okay. Which I feel would have been the due process, even if the end result may have been to destroy the samples. The samples and their proposed fate, to de-identify and release, was discussed in person with Dr. Mellum into September. Dr. Graham denies agreeing to destruction of the samples as well. I sincerely hope we can avoid such a confusion, and I would truly appreciate being kept in the loop if data or specimen destruction is considered when it may be linked to approval or not, when it may be linked to approved or non-approved research. Is that the email that you sent?
Yes.
Okay. So you did not think then that the procedures to decide to destroy the collection were appropriate?
Actually, I don't think that email necessarily says that. My intent in that email is to indicate what the process would have been had we discovered unauthorized research. Now, in this case, I believe there was concern that there was no clear knowledge of what these remaining specimens and samples were and whether they were indeed clinical or research. And so, but our normal process, if an investigator conducts unauthorized research and collects a body of information or samples or specimens without authorization or informed consent from the subjects, then the Research Compliance Committee would make a determination as to the fate of those data and the samples and specimens collected in that process. And to give you an example, if there's an instance where no informed consent was obtained, but somebody collected blood samples from patients, for example, and stored them, then the Research Compliance Committee would evaluate that serious noncompliance, and as part of that evaluation would then look at what would be done with those collected samples. And in the absence of informed consent, the usual action RCC takes in those cases is to actually destroy the samples, because the primary determinant that the RCC considers is the subject's intent as to what was to be done with the samples.
Dr. Snell, you've just described this as kind of an abstract discussion of procedures, but this chain of emails all had to do with the specific destruction of this set of Legionella and other bacteria samples, didn't it?
This was related to the collection in question and the rest of this email string, correct?
all of you saw the first panel discussion. And you heard Dr. Yu and Dr. Stout and Dr. Snydman say that this was a very valuable collection that had been used in many peer-reviewed articles. Dr. Stout said, for instance, it had been useful to her in developing the protocols for dealing with Legionella in the water supply of VA hospitals, and that the research collection was invaluable for that work. We've just heard that this was just a bunch of broken bottles. Dr. Sonnell, do you believe the testimony given by the first panel was not true with respect to the value and the scientific integrity of that sample?
I cannot comment to the actual value of the scientific value of the collection that they're talking about, and that's due to the fact that the protocols that we've had at hand and the only existing protocol that was in effect at the time that the Special Pathogens Lab was closed did not make any reference to retaining any collection of samples or specimens. So a scientific protocol should describe how the collection is going to be accumulated, what are going to be the storage conditions, and how they're going to be disposed of. So what I'm trying to say is we can review research based on the protocol and the materials that are provided to us, and that's what guides how they're collected and how they're stored. And I did not have that information, so I cannot tell you how valuable that collection was, because I have no way of verifying that what was disposed of that we're discussing is actually what they indicate it is.
I think what you just said is you don't know?
I do not know.
Okay. Did you do anything to find out?
Well, that was my intent when I arranged that meeting with the Research Compliance Office and the Special Pathogens Lab staff, was to find out what the request was about, what it entailed, what sort of samples were in question. That is correct. I did not know what they were.
Okay. And they were destroyed before you could, in fact?
Yes. Apparently they were disposed of before we could have that meeting or that request further.
Did Dr. Mellon consult with you at all, knowing that you were in discussions about what to do with the samples, about her decision, apparently her decision to destroy all the samples, all of the bacteria?
She did not. The first time Dr. Melham directly got into that email string was that afternoon about that meeting. So prior to that, there was no discussion, and after that, she did not discuss the disposition with me.
Okay. Dr. Mellham, you heard the testimony of the first panel that this was a first-rate collection of research samples collected or that represented 30 years of research, that it was cataloged, it was stored in the appropriate manner, and now you have testified that these were just some loose, broken bottles. Was the first panel testifying incorrectly? Did Dr. Yu testify incorrectly? Did Dr. Stout? Did Dr. Snydman?
Sir, Dr. Stout is a full-time clinical lab employee, and as such, her mission was to test clinical patient specimens.
That's really not the question at all.
The specimens in the freezer were, as far as I'm concerned, clinical patient specimens that were to be destroyed within 2 weeks after the clinical results have been released into the computer and the patients taken care of.
You did not understand that any of the vials in the refrigerator were for research specimens, not clinical.
Sir, I have asked Dr. Stout to present us with whatever lists and maps or boxes or whatever in that freezer, and she did not comply.
Did you tell her that unless I get something from you by December 4th, I'm destroying all this stuff?
I did not, and I don't have to, because I have asked her 3 times in a row between January and April or May, and there was no answer and no reply.
You mentioned earlier that was in one email. Were they all in emails? Were they all in writing?
We had a meeting with her that also included the chief of pathology and lab medicine and the then chief of infectious disease.
Dr. Mellum, I think Ms. Wansley also verified, as did Dr. Stout and Dr. Yu, that this collection, the vials had numbers and letters on them suggesting that there was a catalog system in place. Do you deny that?
I have not seen any log or any map of that.
But you saw the vials.
They looked like patients' first letter and 4 digits of social security number, which we use to identify patient specimens.
But you thought they were clinical specimens.
I thought they were clinical specimens.
Did you ask anyone whether that was correct? Didn't Dr. Stout and Dr. Yu tell you that they were research specimens?
Dr. Stout and Dr. Yu were non-cooperative in any of these encounters with them, with their staff, with anybody. Dr. Stout came to the lab at midnight between the 19th of July and the 20th of July and took away boxes of patients' care material and took them off-site with the help of 2 non-VA personnel. And I have no idea what was taken away. I have no idea what came back. This is not good faith.
Is that why you destroyed the sample?
This was not why. I'm just telling you that they have no cooperation. I had no cooperation of any kind from the people who are now claiming responsibility.
Dr. Mellum, I really don't need to be persuaded that all of you all didn't get along all that well.
I had no problem with any of them. That's not true. That's not true.
Sir, I would just say that in every organization, there are certain procedures and rules that need to be followed. And one of the responsibilities that I had as the hospital director is research must be done to protect humans, and it has to be done in compliance with rule and reg. And so that was one of the major issues that we had. And a scientific collection must have a catalog. And if the researcher is requested to provide that catalog, it should be provided immediately. All the other researchers in that building, 2 of them, with substantial collections, immediately provided that catalog and assisted us in the removal. So what I was left with, sir,
Mr.
was
Mellum,
a collection of things that were
from your testimony
unidentified.
earlier today and from what you have said to our staff, other than a discussion in July, you were not part of this decision to destroy the samples. Isn't that right?
Again, my assumption was that in July, anything that was collected and had a catalog was moved. Everything else was destroyed.
But you were not part of the decision on December 4th. Okay.
No.
So your statement really doesn't pertain to any question I have asked. I don't know that we need to keep asking.
Testimony's been quite interesting.
Well, the testimony has been quite at variance with the documents that were earlier provided and with the staff interviews. And I thought that this hearing today would probably be the end of our committee's involvement. It may be the end of our committee's involvement, but it might be the end of this decision generally, this issue generally, but perhaps not. I have no further questions, and this hearing. I don't think that I've actually formally moved to enter the documents into the record. So without objection, it is so ordered. And you all have written testimony in front of you. Will you provide that to the committee now? All 5 of you? Okay. The hearing is adjourned.